Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am glad you are here tonight. Settle into whatever place you have chosen. Maybe you're stretched out in bed. Maybe you're sitting on a couch with the lights turned down. Maybe you're listening through headphones while the rest of the house has already gone quiet. Before we begin, take a moment and notice the sounds around you. Perhaps there is traffic outside. Perhaps a fan is running nearby. Maybe, somewhere in the distance, you can hear a siren moving through the streets. Most of us barely respond to that sound anymore. A siren passes, grows louder for a few seconds, and then fades. We assume that someone has answered a call. We assume that a vehicle is moving toward an emergency. We assume that behind the sound there is a dispatcher, a radio, a patrol car, and a uniformed officer who's been sent to deal with whatever has happened. That assumption is so ordinary that we rarely recognise it as an assumption at all. Tonight, we're going to Memphis, Tennessee, in August of 1978, when that ordinary confidence was suddenly taken away. For 8 days, most of the officers normally responsible for patrolling the city refused to work. Police stations were surrounded by pickets. Patrol shifts were left severely reduced. Sheriff's deputies, supervisors, state troopers, and members of the Tennessee National Guard were brought in to cover a city of roughly 650,000 people. A nighttime curfew emptied streets that were normally busy. Businesses closed early. Residents hurried home before the deadline. Firefighters eventually joined the walkout, leaving Memphis without much of its normal emergency system at the same moment that city officials were struggling to replace the police. This was not a fictional experiment. It was not a rehearsal. And it was not a warning issued by nervous politicians about what might happen someday. It happened. At approximately 11 o'clock on the night of August 10th, 1978, members of the Memphis Police Association began walking away from their assignments. Most of the patrol officers and sergeants responsible for ordinary police protection joined them. By the following morning, Mayor Wyeth Chandler had declared a civil emergency and placed the city under a curfew. Think about 11 o'clock at night for a moment. What is usually happening in a city at that hour? Restaurants are closing their kitchens, bartenders are wiping down counters, hospital workers are changing shifts, parents are waiting for teenagers to come home, truck drivers are moving through industrial districts, hotel clerks are checking in late arrivals, someone is discovering that a back door has been forced open, someone is hearing an argument through an apartment wall, someone is standing beside a damaged car after a collision. Someone is reaching for a telephone because a situation has moved beyond what they can handle alone. A city does not go to sleep all at once. It changes shifts. Memphis was changing shifts when its police force began to disappear. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a large city where patrol cars pass regularly, or somewhere quiet where the arrival of a police vehicle would bring people to their windows? And what time is it where you are? Is your own neighbourhood still active? Or have the streets outside already settled down? It is worth asking because the people of Memphis had to begin thinking about their streets in a different way almost immediately. They had to consider how much of their normal routine depended on the expectation that someone wearing a badge was nearby, even when no officer could be seen. If this kind of slow walk through overlooked history helps you relax, you can subscribe to the channel and leave a like. There is no need to interrupt what you're doing. You can decide later, once the room is quiet and the story has had time to settle in. You can also leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these ordinary pieces of history travel. For now, let us return to Memphis on Thursday, August 10th, 1978. The day had been hot. August in Memphis does not encourage patience. The air can remain heavy after sunset, holding the heat between buildings and above pavement. Air conditioners strain. Windows stay open in homes that do not have them. Tempers do not always improve when the sun goes down. The city already had reason to be tired. Only 6 weeks earlier, Memphis firefighters had staged a strike of their own. On July 1st, approximately 1,400 firefighters walked away from their stations after negotiations over wages and working conditions collapsed. During that earlier emergency, more than 200 fires were reported within a single 24-hour period, many of them believed to have been deliberately set. Mayor Chandler declared a civil emergency, imposed a curfew, restricted the sale of gasoline in containers, and called in the National Guard. The firefighters returned after several days under pressure from a court order and a promise of mediation, but the dispute had not truly been resolved. That July strike mattered because when the police walked out in August, Memphis was not entering unfamiliar territory. The city had already spent part of the summer watching smoke rise, while emergency crews struggled to keep up. Residents had already heard the word curfew. National Guard uniforms had already appeared on the streets. The fear had not completely left. It had merely been stored away. Memphis also carried older memories. 10 years had passed since the sanitation workers' strike of 1968, the labour struggle that brought Martin Luther King Jr. to the city. Memphis residents remembered marches, confrontations, broken windows, National Guard vehicles, curfews, and the assassination at the Lorraine Motel. The events of 1968 were not distant history in 1978. They remained part of the city's living memory. People who had been adults during the sanitation strike were still raising families and running businesses. Young people who had watched soldiers move through Memphis in 1968 were now old enough to work night shifts, drive taxis, manage stores, or wear uniforms themselves. The appearance of armed troops in the streets therefore carried a meaning that went beyond the immediate emergency. It reminded residents that the city had reached another point where its ordinary institutions could no longer manage events on their own. The 1978 police strike did not begin because officers suddenly decided they disliked their jobs. It grew from months of conflict over pay, benefits, working conditions, and distrust between municipal employees and the city administration. Police work in Memphis was not well paid compared with the risks and demands officers faced. Inflation had made the problem worse. During the 1970s, the cost of housing, food, gasoline, and household goods rose sharply across the United States. A salary that had seemed manageable a few years earlier could feel inadequate by the end of the decade. That pressure reached police households just as it reached everyone else. An officer might spend a shift responding to domestic disputes, robberies, automobile accidents, and violent calls, then return home and discover that his paycheck was no longer covering what it once had. The uniform provided authority in public, but it did not lower the price of groceries. A badge did not make a mortgage payment easier. The city expected discipline, availability, and personal risk. Officers expected compensation that reflected those demands. City officials had their own problem. Memphis did not have an unlimited supply of money. Any substantial wage increase for police and firefighters would affect the municipal budget, taxes, and every other service competing for funds. Mayor Chandler argued that the city could not simply agree to every demand placed before it. Union members believed the administration repeatedly used financial caution as a reason to postpone meaningful improvements. The disagreement became personal. That often happens in prolonged labour disputes. The original argument may concern percentages, schedules, overtime rules, or insurance. After enough meetings fail, the numbers begin to represent something else. A rejected proposal becomes proof of disrespect. A public statement becomes an insult. A legal order becomes an attempt at humiliation. Each side begins to believe that giving ground will reward the other side's bad faith. By August, Memphis was no longer dealing with a calm disagreement over a contract. It was dealing with a relationship that had broken down. The Memphis Police Association had negotiated with the city, but rank-and-file frustration was becoming difficult for union leaders to control. This distinction is important. The walkout was commonly described as a wildcat strike because many officers continued it in defiance not only of the city and the courts, but also of instructions from their own union leadership. That tells us something about how angry the officers had become. A formal union strike usually follows a plan. Leaders call the action, members follow agreed procedures, and negotiators retain some control over when workers return. A wildcat strike is less orderly. It grows from the membership itself, often because workers no longer trust ordinary channels to produce a result. On the night of August 10th, many Memphis officers reached that point. The walkout began around 11. Officers left their duties and gathered outside police facilities. Picket lines formed. According to the federal court record produced during the emergency, some strikers damaged city property, blocked access to stations, and threatened officers who remained at work. Most patrol officers and sergeants joined the strike, reducing the department's normal street presence at the moment tension was highest. Imagine arriving for the overnight shift as one of the officers who intended to remain on duty. The police station ahead of you is surrounded by people you know. They are not strangers. They are officers who have stood beside you at accident scenes and answered calls when you needed assistance. You know their families. You have eaten meals with them during quiet parts of long shifts. Some are shouting, others are trying to persuade you to turn around. The disagreement is no longer taking place across a negotiating table. It is happening at the entrance to your workplace. If you cross the line, you may be treated as a traitor by your colleagues. If you refuse to cross it, you are abandoning your assignment during a public emergency. There is no comfortable decision. Inside the stations, supervisors began calculating what remained. Command officers and non-striking personnel could answer some calls, but a police department is built around numbers, geography, and response time. A supervisor cannot occupy several neighbourhoods at once. A detective can be placed in a patrol car, but that does not instantly recreate an ordinary patrol division. Officers unfamiliar with a particular district may not know its streets, recurring problems, businesses, shortcuts, and residents, as well as the patrol officers normally assigned there. Shelby County Sheriff's deputies were brought into Memphis. State resources were prepared. The Tennessee National Guard would soon become one of the most visible signs that normal policing had collapsed. Yet the first hours were filled with uncertainty. No one knew how many officers would return the next morning. No one knew whether the strike would end after a court order, whether negotiations would resume, or whether the walkout would spread to other municipal workers. No one knew how residents would respond once they learned that most patrol officers were no longer answering calls. This uncertainty mattered as much as the actual number of officers on the streets. A city can remain calm during a crisis when people believe the crisis is controlled. It becomes harder when no one knows what will happen next. Rumours spread quickly. Some residents heard that there were no police at all, which was not accurate. Supervisors, non-striking officers, sheriff's deputies and other personnel continued to provide limited protection. Others heard that criminals were already moving through the city without restraint. Some worried about fires, especially after the experience of July. Business owners wondered whether to close. Parents called children who were away from home. Employees working late tried to learn whether they would be allowed to travel. The absence of ordinary information allowed imagination to fill the gaps. That process was slower than the instant panic we might picture today. There were no social media feeds updating every rumour by the second. There were telephones, radio broadcasts, television reports, and conversations between neighbours. News moved through Memphis by local stations, calls between relatives and people repeating what they had heard from someone who claimed to know an officer. It could still travel quickly. By Friday morning, August 11th, Mayor Chandler had declared a state of civil emergency. He initially imposed a general curfew running from 8 in the evening until 6 in the morning. The curfew was later adjusted to begin at 10, but during the opening phase the message was plain. Residents were expected to leave the streets before darkness settled over the city. A curfew changes a city long before the official hour arrives. Suppose you own a small restaurant. Normally, the evening crowd provides much of your income. Now you must decide when to stop seating customers so your workers can clean the kitchen and drive home before the deadline. Suppose your shift ends at a hospital after the curfew begins. You may be exempt because your work is essential, but you still need identification, and you may have to explain yourself at a checkpoint. Suppose you are visiting friends across town. The conversation becomes shorter because everyone is watching the clock. Suppose you are a teenager. Your parents do not care that you are planning to come home later. The mayor has placed the city under emergency rules, and you are expected inside. Memphis did not become completely silent at 8 o'clock, but its rhythm changed. Traffic thinned. Businesses lost customers. Entertainment districts emptied earlier than usual. The people who remained on the road became more noticeable precisely because so many others had gone home. For some residents, staying inside felt sensible. For others, it felt like punishment for a conflict they had not created. Civil liberties organisations questioned whether the mayor's emergency powers were being used too broadly. The American Civil Liberties Union of West Tennessee filed suit, arguing that the curfew violated constitutional rights and that the emergency ordinance had not been properly applied. A federal judge ultimately allowed the curfew to remain in effect during the crisis. Inside homes across Memphis, families watched television reports and listened for sounds outside. A passing vehicle could make someone look through the curtains. A distant siren raised the question of who was driving toward the call. Smoke in the distance carried more weight than it normally would. Neighbours who rarely discussed public policy began talking about wages, unions, the mayor, taxes, crime, and whether police officers should ever be allowed to strike. That last question sat at the centre of the crisis. A factory worker can stop a production line. A teacher can close a classroom. A sanitation worker can allow garbage to accumulate. Each of those actions can cause serious hardship, but a police strike carries a different fear because the public imagines the result not simply as inconvenience, but as the removal of protection. Police officers argued that this belief was exactly what made their labour valuable. If the city depended on them so completely, they asked, why was that dependence not reflected in their compensation? The city argued that the same dependence created an obligation that prevented officers from walking away. If police were permitted to strike whenever negotiations failed, public safety could become a bargaining tool. Both arguments made sense to the people making them. Neither argument placed more officers in patrol cars that Friday morning. Court orders soon directed the strikers to return. Mayor Chandler warned that officers who ignored the order could be treated as having resigned. Striking officers were told that their jobs and paychecks were at risk. Union leaders urged members to return, but many rank-and-file officers refused. By the third day, the walkout continued despite the judge's order, the mayor's ultimatum, and appeals from within the union itself. This is where the event stopped looking like an ordinary contract dispute. The officers were not merely threatening to strike, they were already off the streets. The mayor was not merely warning them about consequences, he was preparing to remove them from the payroll. Courts were issuing orders that hundreds of trained law enforcement officers were openly defying. National Guard units were moving into the city. A curfew was restricting hundreds of thousands of residents. And the timing added one more complication. The first anniversary of Elvis Presley's death was approaching on August 16th. Visitors had planned to travel to Memphis and gather near Graceland. Local businesses expected fans, tourists, and media attention. Instead, reports of a police strike and curfew caused many people to stay away. Even Graceland's security officials acknowledged that visitors were being discouraged by the emergency. Memphis was therefore caught between two versions of itself. It was the city of blues music, Beale Street, barbecue, river traffic, churches, factories, neighbourhoods, and Graceland. It was also a city under curfew, with soldiers preparing to patrol streets normally covered by municipal officers. Residents still went to work, stores still opened, children still needed meals, hospital patients still needed treatment. Most of daily life continued because daily life usually does continue during a civic crisis. But every routine now carried a question. Would the streets remain calm after dark? Would the officers return? Would the firefighters join them? Would the city compromise? Or would the mayor dismiss hundreds of police officers and attempt to rebuild the department? No one yet knew that the strike would last 8 days. The people living through the first night did not have the comfort of a known ending. They had Friday morning, a curfew order, reduced patrols, court threats, and a long summer weekend ahead. As Memphis moved toward its first full night without most of its regular patrol officers, the city began assembling a replacement system from whatever people and equipment could be found. Sheriff's deputies took unfamiliar routes. Police supervisors returned to street duty. National Guard soldiers received orders to enter neighborhoods where residents still remembered seeing troops 10 years earlier. The badges had not vanished completely, but there were not enough of them. Soon military vehicles would appear beneath traffic lights. Armed guardsmen would stand where patrol officers normally stood. Drivers would slow at checkpoints and reach for identification. The streets would look controlled from a distance, yet behind that appearance was a basic problem that uniforms and vehicles could not immediately solve. A soldier is not a city patrol officer. He does not know which convenience store owner calls about every suspicious noise. He may not recognize the elderly resident who regularly becomes confused and wanders away from home. He does not know which apartment argument is ordinary shouting and which one is becoming dangerous. He has not spent years learning which streets flood, which alleys connect, which businesses remain open after midnight, and which people can calm a crowd before an arrest becomes necessary. Memphis was about to discover the difference between placing armed personnel on a street and restoring the complicated network of local knowledge that ordinary policing requires. That discovery began during the first curfew, when residents moved indoors, soldiers moved outward, and the city tried to make one emergency system perform the work of another. A soldier is not a city patrol officer. He can stand at an intersection, guard a public building, enforce a curfew, or stop a vehicle after dark. He can carry a rifle and follow an order. What he cannot do immediately is replace years of local experience. He does not know which store owner regularly forgets to lock the rear entrance. He does not recognize the teenager whose parents have reported him missing before. He may not know which elderly resident becomes confused after sunset, which apartment building produces frequent arguments, or which narrow street provides the fastest route around a blocked intersection. Memphis was about to learn how much ordinary policing depended on knowledge that was rarely written down. By the first full day of the strike, approximately 950 patrol officers and sergeants had left their posts. Around 200 supervisors and a small number of non-striking officers remained. They were joined by Shelby County Sheriff's deputies, state personnel, and members of the Tennessee National Guard, but the city's normal patrol structure had been severely reduced. Residents did not wake on Friday morning to find every police station empty. Calls could still be made. Some patrol cars continued moving through the city. Arrests were still possible. The county jail remained open, and the courts had not stopped operating. What disappeared was the confidence that a routine call would receive a routine response. Under normal conditions, police departments sort calls by urgency. An armed robbery receives immediate attention. A report about a suspicious vehicle may wait. A violent domestic dispute takes priority over a complaint about loud music. A traffic collision involving injuries receives a faster response than a minor collision in a parking lot. During the strike, the distance between urgent and non-urgent calls became much greater. Dispatchers had to decide which incidents justified sending one of the few available units. Supervisors who normally managed officers from desks or command positions returned to patrol work. Detectives accustomed to investigating crimes after they occurred were placed in vehicles and asked to help answer calls. Sheriff's deputies entered parts of Memphis that were outside their usual assignments. The system still functioned, but it functioned under pressure. A resident reporting a stolen bicycle could not expect the same attention as someone reporting a man with a gun. A shopkeeper who found a broken window might wait while the available officers responded to more dangerous incidents. A family involved in a minor traffic accident might exchange information without an officer present. Complaints that would normally produce a visit could be recorded and postponed. The people making those calls did not always know why no one had arrived. They knew only that they had telephoned the police and were still waiting. This changed behaviour before it changed official statistics. Doors were locked earlier. Store managers counted receipts and closed before the curfew. Parents called children home well before the deadline. Some residents who normally walked to a nearby shop chose to drive. Others avoided leaving the house altogether. Neighbours paid more attention to unfamiliar vehicles and sounds in alleys. Memphis did not immediately become a city of organised neighbourhood patrols with armbands and schedules. Most changes were smaller than that. A man who normally went to bed without checking the back door checked it twice. A woman living alone left a porch light on through the night. A family telephoned relatives to confirm that everyone had reached home safely. Someone who heard breaking glass looked through a curtain but decided not to go outside. The curfew played a large role in keeping the streets manageable. Mayor Wyeth Chandler first ordered residents indoors between 8 in the evening and 6 in the morning. The starting time was later moved to 10, but the restrictions still covered the hours when bars, restaurants, theatres, music venues and late-night businesses normally depended on customers. A curfew is simple when written as an order. Living under one is more complicated. Essential workers needed to travel. Hospital employees, utility crews, journalists, security personnel, and some industrial workers had legitimate reasons to remain on the road. Residents could not always tell whether a person driving after the deadline was exempt, ignoring the order, or committing a crime. National Guard troops and replacement law enforcement personnel had to make those distinctions at checkpoints. Drivers carried identification and explanations. A nurse leaving a hospital might show an employee badge. A newspaper worker could present credentials. A factory employee might carry a letter from a supervisor. Someone transporting a sick relative had to explain the emergency clearly enough to avoid delay. For most residents, the safest decision was to be home early. Restaurants began losing their evening business. Entertainment venues faced cancellations. Bars could not operate normally when customers needed enough time to finish their drinks, pay, leave, and cross the city before the curfew began. Employees also needed time to clean, close, and reach their own homes. The economic damage did not arrive as one dramatic loss. It accumulated one empty table at a time. A restaurant owner still had food in the kitchen and workers on the schedule. Rent, electricity, insurance, and other expenses continued. What disappeared were the customers who might have arrived at 9 or 10 in the evening. Some businesses shortened their hours voluntarily because remaining open no longer made sense. Others closed because employees were nervous about travelling. Memphis nightlife was especially vulnerable. The city's identity was connected to music and evening entertainment, but a curfew does not make exceptions for atmosphere. Musicians who normally started late had little reason to perform for an audience required to leave early. Clubs that earned most of their money after dark could not replace those receipts during the afternoon. The timing made the disruption more visible. August 16th would mark the first anniversary of Elvis Presley's death. Fans had planned to travel to Memphis and gather near Graceland. Hotels, restaurants, shops, taxi drivers and other businesses expected visitors. Instead, reports of a police strike, armed patrols and a nighttime curfew persuaded many people to stay away. Those who still came found a city trying to present two different faces. Around Graceland, visitors carried flowers, photographs, and personal messages. They came to mourn a singer whose death had shocked them 1 year earlier. Elsewhere, military vehicles moved through intersections and armed guardsmen enforced emergency rules. A visitor could spend the afternoon standing near Elvis Presley's grave, and the evening hurrying back to a hotel before the curfew. The contrast was unusual, but daily life continued around it. Grocery stores opened, mail was delivered, offices operated, buses ran. People went to medical appointments and reported for work. Children played indoors or in yards while adults discussed whether it was safe for them to go farther. A civic emergency rarely stops everything. It changes the conditions under which ordinary things happen. The National Guard became the most obvious sign of those changed conditions. Approximately 1,500 guardsmen would eventually be involved in policing and emergency duties during the combined police and firefighter strikes. They patrolled with sheriff's deputies and the personnel who remained at work. Their vehicles appeared in commercial districts, near government buildings, and along streets that residents normally associated with local patrol cars. Some people found their presence reassuring. A visible armed patrol suggested that the city had not been abandoned. Business owners could point to guardsmen and tell employees that protection remained available. Residents worried about looting or violence saw that the streets were not entirely unguarded. Others were uncomfortable. Memphis had seen National Guard troops during the upheaval surrounding the sanitation workers' strike and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. For many black residents, soldiers in the streets were connected to memories of military vehicles, rifles, curfews, and government force used during a period of racial conflict. 10 years was not long enough to turn those memories into distant history. A resident who had seen troops after King's assassination might now watch another guard vehicle pass the same neighbourhood. The circumstances were different, but the equipment and uniforms looked familiar. The city government described the deployment as a public safety measure. Some residents saw protection. Others saw a reminder of how quickly civilian streets could acquire a military presence. The guardsmen themselves faced an assignment for which ordinary military training provided only part of the preparation. Guarding a fixed location was straightforward. Responding to a family dispute was not. Directing traffic could be learned quickly. Deciding whether a frightened resident, an intoxicated customer, or an angry neighbour required arrest demanded a different kind of judgment. Whenever possible, guardsmen worked with law enforcement personnel rather than replacing them completely. Sheriff's deputies and non-striking officers handled tasks requiring police authority or local experience. The Guard supplied manpower, visibility, transportation and support. This arrangement reduced some dangers, but it did not restore normal service. Consider a domestic disturbance. Under ordinary conditions, patrol officers arriving at a home might separate the people involved, check for injuries, determine whether a weapon was present, speak to neighbours, and decide whether someone needed to be arrested. An officer who had visited the same address before might already know the family and its history. During the strike, a deputy unfamiliar with the neighbourhood might arrive with military support. The sight of several armed men could stop an argument, but it could also increase fear. A situation normally handled through conversation now carried the appearance of a major emergency. Traffic enforcement changed as well. Minor violations received less attention because the available personnel had more urgent responsibilities. Drivers still faced the possibility of being stopped, especially during curfew hours, but ordinary daytime enforcement could not remain at its previous level. Officers were needed for calls involving violence, property crime, crowd control, and protection of public facilities. Some motorists probably drove more carefully because they knew the city was under emergency rules. Others may have assumed that no one had time to notice them. The same uncertainty affected people considering theft or burglary. Predictions of unrestricted crime had helped justify the curfew. The federal court reviewing the emergency order accepted that the sudden loss of most patrol officers could leave Memphis exposed to widespread criminal activity. Yet the city did not instantly collapse into the uncontrolled lawlessness that some residents feared. Several forces worked against it. The curfew removed many potential victims and witnesses from public streets. Businesses closed and secured their buildings early. Guardsmen and deputies were highly visible. News coverage made it clear that emergency personnel were present, even if the regular police were not. Residents were alert and more likely to notice unusual activity. The strike therefore produced a strange combination of reduced police capacity and increased public caution. A burglar might believe fewer officers were available, but he also had to move through streets with less traffic, where any vehicle or pedestrian attracted attention. A person breaking into a store after curfew could not blend into a crowd because there was no crowd. A deputy or guard patrol might see him simply because almost no one else was outside. This did not mean crime stopped. There were burglaries, thefts, fires, disorder, and reports of looting. Calls continued to arrive. The emergency system was stretched, and some offences undoubtedly received less attention than they would have under normal conditions. Later memories of the strike included both claims that the city remained surprisingly calm and recollections of fires and looting in particular areas. Those accounts are not necessarily contradictory. A city of more than 500,000 people can be calm in one neighbourhood and frightening in another. A downtown street can be empty while a residential block deals with a fire. One family can experience the strike mainly as an inconvenience, while another waits for help during a serious emergency. Public descriptions of a crisis tend to flatten these differences. City officials had reason to say Memphis remained under control. They needed to discourage panic, reassure businesses, and demonstrate that the mayor's emergency measures were working. Strikers had reason to emphasise how essential their labour was. They wanted residents to recognise the risks of operating without them. News organisations looked for visible signs of disruption, because an empty intersection or military patrol could communicate the scale of the event quickly. Ordinary residents were left between those accounts. The mayor said the city could maintain order. The strikers said normal protection could not continue without them. Both sides needed the public to believe something about the streets, and the people living on those streets had to decide what they trusted. For many, the answer depended on neighbourhood experience. Residents of wealthier areas could hire private guards, improve locks, or rely on alarm systems. Some businesses already employed security personnel. Large institutions could place guards at entrances and control access to parking areas. Lower-income residents had fewer options. They could lock doors and watch the street, but they could not purchase a replacement police service. People living in apartment buildings or crowded neighbourhoods could not control who moved through nearby public spaces. Those without reliable cars also depended more heavily on walking and public transportation, making curfew restrictions harder to manage. The strike revealed that public safety was shared in theory but experienced unequally. A homeowner with a strong door, a telephone, a car, and money for private security faced one kind of risk. A worker walking home from a bus stop faced another. A business able to close for a week might survive. A small restaurant living on daily receipts might not. There were also residents whose relationship with the police had never been reassuring. For them, fewer patrols did not automatically mean the loss of a trusted service. Some black Memphians remembered aggressive policing, racial discrimination, and the department's role during earlier civil rights confrontations. They could oppose the strike without romanticising the police force that had gone on strike. This was one of the more complicated parts of the 1978 crisis. The police and fire unions were predominantly white. A decade earlier, many white public safety employees had stood on the side of city authority, while black sanitation workers fought for union recognition and better treatment. Now white officers and firefighters were using labour tactics of their own, including picket lines, collective defiance, and refusal to obey court orders. The reversal was difficult to ignore. Some black residents viewed it with disbelief. The same kind of union action once condemned as dangerous and irresponsible was now being used by employees who had traditionally represented government authority. Police officers accustomed to enforcing court orders were ignoring one. Men who could arrest strikers for blocking access to public property were now standing on picket lines outside their own stations. That contradiction became part of how Memphis understood the walkout. The officers did not see themselves as repeating the sanitation strike. They argued that they were employees facing inadequate pay, poor benefits, and an administration unwilling to bargain fairly. From their perspective, the badge did not erase their rights as workers. Residents could understand the wage complaint and still fear the method. A person might agree that officers deserved more money while believing they had no right to leave the city unprotected. Another might oppose the strike, but blame the mayor for allowing negotiations to deteriorate. Some believed Chandler needed to remain firm because yielding would encourage future walkouts. Others thought his threats and ultimatums made compromise more difficult. These debates entered kitchens, workplaces, church halls, and neighbourhood conversations. People who had never examined a municipal labour contract began discussing percentage increases. They asked how much police officers earned, how overtime worked, and whether city employees had adequate insurance. They also asked what would happen if every essential service used a strike to force concessions. The questions became more urgent when Memphis firefighters joined the police. On August 14th, firefighters began another walkout, only weeks after their July strike. The city now faced the possibility of operating without most of its normal police and fire services at the same time. This changed the calculation for everyone. A delayed police response was frightening. A delayed fire response could become catastrophic within minutes. Fire does not wait for negotiations. It does not care whether a crew is made up of trained municipal firefighters, supervisors, guardsmen, volunteers, or employees called in from another jurisdiction. If no one reaches a burning house quickly, the structure can be lost before officials finish deciding who has authority. Memphis had already seen more than 200 fires during the first day of the July firefighter strike, far above the normal number. That memory returned immediately when the August walkout began. Residents cleared dry material away from homes. Business owners checked extinguishers. Some people kept garden hoses ready. Reports of smoke drew attention because no one knew whether a full crew would arrive. National Guard members and supervisory firefighters attempted to provide emergency coverage. Assistance could also be arranged from surrounding departments, but equipment was only one part of firefighting. Crews needed to know hydrant locations, building layouts, hazardous sites, and local procedures. They needed enough people to operate hoses, enter structures, search rooms, drive engines, and maintain water supplies. The absence of regular firefighters made every alarm more serious. It also changed how residents viewed the police strike. The first days had allowed some people to treat the dispute as a confrontation between officers and the mayor. Once firefighters walked out, the problem became a broader collapse in relations between Memphis and its public employees. Sanitation workers briefly honoured picket lines as well, and garbage began to remain in the streets. Public school teachers were discussing their own labour position. For a short time, it appeared possible that one dispute might encourage another, until several basic city services were disrupted together. Each added problem made the curfew feel less temporary. Days under emergency rules developed routines of their own. People learned which roads had checkpoints. Employers adjusted schedules. Families planned shopping earlier. News reports became part of the morning and evening routine. Residents listened for announcements about court hearings, union votes, and negotiations. The unusual slowly became familiar. A guard vehicle at an intersection no longer caused everyone to stop and stare. An employee showed identification at a checkpoint without needing instructions. Restaurant owners calculated another evening of lost receipts. Police supervisors prepared for another undermanned shift. The city was functioning, but it was functioning around the strike rather than beyond it. Then, during the 6th day of the emergency, Memphis lost electricity. A private security guard at a major utility substation threw a bank of switches and caused a citywide blackout. Authorities found no connection between the blackout and the labour dispute, but residents did not know that when the lights first failed. For a city already living under curfew with police and firefighters on strike, the sudden darkness seemed like confirmation that the emergency was spreading. Air conditioners stopped in the August heat. Traffic signals went dark. Televisions and radios fell silent unless they had battery power. Store alarms and security systems were affected. Hospital generators activated. Residents who had spent days watching for trouble now stood in darkened houses, wondering whether the blackout was accidental. Replacement patrols had to move through streets without normal lighting. Intersections became more dangerous. Every report of smoke or breaking glass became harder to assess. The electricity was eventually restored, and the blackout was traced to one man rather than a coordinated attack. Even so, the incident exposed how tense Memphis had become. An equipment failure that would normally have been treated as a utility emergency was immediately interpreted through the strike. People had learned to expect the next disruption. By then, The question was no longer whether Memphis could survive one night without most of its police. It had done that. The city had survived several nights through curfew, military support, county assistance, private security, and widespread caution. The more difficult question was how long such a system could continue. National Guard troops could patrol temporarily, but they could not become the city's permanent police force. Sheriff's deputies had responsibilities outside Memphis. Supervisors could work extended shifts, but exhaustion would eventually affect judgment. Businesses could tolerate several quiet evenings, but prolonged losses threatened jobs and incomes. Residents could stay indoors for a time, but a city could not maintain ordinary life under an indefinite nighttime restriction. The emergency measures prevented immediate collapse, but they also postponed a decision. Every day the streets remained mostly controlled gave Mayor Chandler evidence that the city would not be forced into surrender. Every day regular officers remained absent, reminded residents that the replacement system was limited. The strikers watched the same streets and reached the opposite conclusion. They believed the guard vehicles, curfew, closed businesses, and emergency court hearings demonstrated exactly how much Memphis depended on them. The public saw order, but it was expensive order. It required soldiers, legal action, lost business, altered schedules, and thousands of private decisions made by people trying not to create another demand on the weakened system. Behind the empty streets was a conflict that could not be solved by adding another checkpoint. To understand why hundreds of officers were willing to risk dismissal, violate a court order, face public anger, and leave their own neighborhoods under military patrol, Memphis had to look past the uniforms standing outside the stations and examine the men who had chosen not to wear them. Behind the empty streets was a conflict that could not be solved by adding another checkpoint. To understand why hundreds of officers were willing to risk dismissal, violate a court order, face public anger, and leave their own neighborhoods under military patrol, Memphis had to look past the uniforms standing outside the stations and examine the men who had chosen not to wear them. The phrase police officer creates a simple public image. There is uniform, a badge, a patrol car, a radio, and the legal authority to stop, question, and arrest. Those things make the officer appear to be part of the government rather than an employee of it. That difference becomes important during a labour dispute. A factory worker is clearly understood to be a worker. A driver is understood to be a worker. A teacher may hold public responsibility, but most people still recognise that a teacher has a salary, a supervisor, working hours, health insurance, and a contract. Police officers occupy a less comfortable position. They exercise power on behalf of the city, yet they also receive paychecks from the city. They enforce laws and court orders, but they can become angry with the officials who write those checks and issue those orders. They are expected to place public duty above personal interest, even though they have families, debts, medical bills, and household expenses like everyone else. In Memphis, this contradiction had been building for years. The officers who walked out in August 1978 were not all young men looking for excitement. Some had served through the unrest of the previous decade. Some had worked during the sanitation workers' strike in 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the riots that followed, and the curfews imposed afterward. They had seen Memphis at its most divided. They had worked long shifts while soldiers stood in the streets and smoke rose above parts of the city. A decade later, some of those same officers found themselves standing on a picket line. That reversal surprised many residents because the Memphis Police Department had a reputation for being disciplined, conservative, and resistant to union militancy. Police officers were expected to prevent strikes from disrupting public order, not lead a strike themselves. Yet by the 1970s, officers across the United States were beginning to think of themselves more openly as public employees with collective interests. Memphis reflected that national change. 2 police organizations were formed in the department in 1973. The Memphis Police Association became the bargaining representative for patrol officers and sergeants. while the Afro-American Police Association addressed the concerns of black officers working within a department that still carried the effects of segregation and racial discrimination. The creation of these groups showed that the uniform did not erase differences in rank, race, pay, promotion, or working conditions. The department presented a united face to the public, but life inside it was more complicated. Patrol officers worked at the bottom of the command structure. They answered calls, made traffic stops, completed reports, transported prisoners, settled disputes, and spent long hours moving through the city. Sergeants supervised them directly, but remained close enough to street duty to share many of the same frustrations. Above them were lieutenants, captains, inspectors, and senior administrators. Those officials had greater authority and in many cases different pay, schedules, and relationships with city government. During the strike, many supervisors remained at work while patrol officers and sergeants walked out. That division was partly practical because the Memphis Police Association represented the lower ranks. It also revealed how differently the department could look depending on where a person stood within it. For an officer in a patrol car, the job was measured in calls. A shift could begin quietly and change within minutes. An officer might move from a traffic collision to a family argument, then to a burglary report, then to a tavern fight. He might spend an hour writing reports after an arrest and then be sent across his district because another unit was already occupied. The work involved long periods of routine interrupted by moments when a decision had to be made immediately. Was the person reaching into a pocket carrying a weapon or an identification card? Was the man shouting in a house merely angry, or was someone inside in danger? Was a vehicle moving slowly because the driver was lost, intoxicated, or looking for a place to commit a crime? Those judgments carried consequences for residents and officers alike. The public saw the uniform. The officer also felt the heat inside it. Memphis summers made patrol work physically uncomfortable, especially in an era when equipment and vehicle air conditioning were less reliable than they would later become. Officers wore body equipment, climbed stairs, stood beside wrecked vehicles, entered crowded buildings, and spent time outdoors on pavement that held the day's heat after sunset. The police radio ensured that they were rarely beyond reach. A meal could be interrupted, a report could be postponed, the end of a shift could arrive while an officer was still handling an arrest or waiting at a hospital. The job also followed officers home in less visible ways. An officer's spouse knew that a routine shift could become dangerous. Children learned that a parent might miss dinner, arrive late, or sleep during the day after working overnight. Families arranged their schedules around rotating shifts, court appearances, overtime, and emergency call-ins. The city paid for the officers' time, but the household absorbed much of the disruption. By 1978, inflation was making those sacrifices more difficult to accept. Prices had risen sharply throughout the decade. Food, gasoline, housing, utilities, and medical care took larger portions of ordinary incomes. A wage increase that appeared reasonable when negotiated could lose much of its value before the next contract was completed. Public employees felt this pressure strongly because their salaries were tied to municipal budgets and political decisions. A private company might raise prices when costs increased. A city had to find money through taxes, fees, budget reductions, or borrowing. Every increase for one group of workers became a public debate. Memphis officers watched their purchasing power weaken, while city officials asked them to remain patient. The dispute was often described as a fight over wages, but the surviving historical research suggests that money alone does not fully explain the walkout. Officers and firefighters felt that the city administration did not respect them or their unions. The economic disagreement became mixed with frustration over recognition, bargaining authority, benefits, and the belief that municipal leaders treated their concerns as demands to be contained rather than problems to be resolved. That feeling of disrespect matters because employees rarely risk everything over a small numerical difference alone. By the final days of the strike, the police were seeking a one-year contract with a 7% wage increase, retroactive to July 1st, along with binding arbitration by federal officials. Mayor Chandler favoured a 2-year agreement providing a 6% increase in the first year and some improvement in benefits. A survey comparing Memphis with cities of similar size reportedly found that its police and firefighters ranked relatively well in direct pay but poorly in fringe benefits. On paper, the two sides did not appear impossibly far apart. One side proposed 7% for 1 year, the other proposed 6% in the first year of a 2-year arrangement, with additional benefit improvements. A person reading those numbers decades later might wonder how a disagreement of that size placed soldiers in the streets. The answer lies in everything attached to the percentages. The length of the contract mattered because inflation made future wages uncertain. Officers did not want to be locked into terms that might become inadequate before the agreement expired. Binding arbitration mattered because the union wanted a neutral mechanism to resolve future disputes. The mayor resisted giving an outside official power over decisions affecting the city budget. Reprisals mattered because once the strike began, officers needed to know whether returning to work would mean suspension, dismissal, prosecution, or disciplinary charges. Union recognition mattered because Chandler threatened to withdraw the Memphis Police Association status as the bargaining representative. To the strikers, that threat seemed larger than one contract. It suggested that the organisation they had built could be removed if it became too difficult for the city to manage. Each issue increased the cost of surrender. The officers also remembered what had happened to the firefighters earlier that summer. Memphis firefighters had struck in July, returned under court pressure, and entered mediation without resolving the underlying conflict. Police officers could look at that experience and conclude that returning too quickly would weaken their position. This city drew the opposite lesson. Officials believed the July fire strike demonstrated the danger of allowing emergency employees to use public safety as leverage. By August, neither side trusted the other's process. The Memphis Police Association represented roughly 1,000 members of a department with approximately 1,500 officers. When the city presented a wage package calling for a 17% increase over 2 years, the association rejected it. The offer sounded larger when stated as a 2-year total, but officers were examining what it meant year by year, how inflation might affect it, and what other provisions came with it. The rejection did not produce a controlled, carefully planned union action. It produced a rank-and-file rebellion. Police Association President David Barker urged officers to return to work after the strike began. The mayor, the courts, and the union leadership were therefore all telling them to report for duty. Many refused. Barker was shouted down when he tried to address the strikers from a makeshift platform. That moment explains the wildcat nature of the strike better than any formal definition. The men on the line no longer trusted anyone to tell them when their grievance had been handled. They did not trust the mayor. They did not trust the city's negotiating process. Many no longer trusted their own union president to speak for them. A union leader normally offers a bridge between workers and management. Barker discovered that the bridge had collapsed beneath him. The officers gathered outside headquarters were not behaving like a disciplined military formation. They were angry employees moving through a crowd in which frustration could spread faster than careful information. One person shouted that the city was bluffing. Another insisted that returning officers would destroy the strike. Rumours moved through the group. Someone claimed a better offer was coming. Someone else said the mayor planned to fire everyone regardless of what they did. The atmosphere rewarded certainty, even when certainty was not justified. An officer considering a return to work had to make his decision in front of colleagues who might see him as a man willing to benefit from their sacrifice without sharing their risk. The word for such a person in a labour dispute was scab, and it carried real force. Police culture made that pressure especially powerful. Officers depended on one another for safety. A patrol officer entered dangerous situations believing that another officer would respond when called. Loyalty was not only an emotional preference, it was part of surviving the job. Crossing a picket line could therefore be interpreted as more than disagreement over union strategy. It could be seen as a violation of the same solidarity officers relied upon in the street. Around 100 police officers attempted to comply with Mayor Chandler's order and return to duty, but city officials said they were sent home after receiving telephone threats, apparently made by hardline strikers. The federal court record also found that some strikers damaged city property, blocked access to stations, and threatened officers who remained at work. These actions cannot be dismissed as harmless expressions of frustration. The men involved were trained officers. They understood the meaning of intimidation, obstruction, and property damage. They had arrested other people for similar conduct. When they used those tactics during their own labour dispute, they exposed the contradiction at the centre of the strike. They wanted to be treated as workers, yet they possessed authority that ordinary workers did not. They demanded the right to resist the city, yet their profession was built around enforcing lawful orders. They believed loyalty required officers to remain off duty, while the public believed their oath required them to return. The contradiction became even clearer when dozens of striking officers were arrested for violating the curfew they normally would have helped enforce. Early on August 14th, roughly 60 officers were arrested outside Central Police Headquarters after shots were reportedly fired into the air. They were released on their own recognizance. For residents watching the news, the scene was difficult to process. Police officers had been arrested by other law enforcement personnel for breaking an emergency order imposed because police officers were on strike. The men standing outside headquarters did not see themselves as criminals. They saw the arrests as another attempt to break their resolve. Some wore their arrests as evidence that the administration would rather punish officers than negotiate with them. Mayor Chandler saw defiance. The officers saw humiliation. Once dignity enters a labour dispute, compromise becomes harder. A wage offer can be revised. A public insult cannot be removed so easily. A threat made in front of television cameras may remain in the memory of both sides even after the numbers change. Officials fear looking weak. Union members fear looking defeated. Each statement is heard not only by negotiators, but by voters, families, co-workers, and the wider labour movement. Chandler announced that officers ignoring the return-to-work deadline would be considered to have resigned. He said they could collect their final paychecks and warned that the city might withdraw recognition from the Police Association. The personnel office publicised telephone numbers for people interested in joining a rapid police training programme. The message was intended to show that the city could replace the strikers. For the officers, it sounded like proof that the administration considered them disposable. Training a police officer is not a quick process. Applicants must be screened. Recruits must learn law, firearms use, defensive tactics, report writing, traffic procedure, arrest rules, and department policy. They must acquire judgment that cannot be taught completely in a classroom. The idea of a crash replacement program may have reassured residents who wanted the city to act firmly. It also insulted experienced officers who believed their value came from knowledge accumulated through years of service. The strike was therefore becoming a test of identity. Were these men public servants who had abandoned their duty? Were they skilled workers using the only pressure available to them? Were they representatives of government demanding protections from that government? Could they be all three? Race made those questions more difficult. The Memphis police and fire unions were predominantly white, though black and white members participated in the 1978 dispute. 10 years earlier, black sanitation workers had struck for union recognition, safer conditions, and basic dignity. Police officers had been part of the official force used to control marches and unrest during that struggle. Now some of those officers were describing themselves as mistreated workers. For many black residents, the reversal was impossible to ignore. A black Memphis executive interviewed after the settlement expressed astonishment that white police officers had adopted the tactics of organised labour after the role police had played during the 1968 sanitation conflict. Officers rejected the comparison as unfair. and argued that the 1978 strike brought black and white members together around shared economic demands. There was truth and discomfort in both reactions. Black officers faced the same contract dispute as white officers, but they did not necessarily have the same experience inside the department. The Afro-American Police Association had been created because racial inequalities remained. Shared picket lines could temporarily unite officers around pay without removing discrimination in assignments, promotions, discipline, or everyday treatment. The strike demonstrated solidarity, but it did not prove that the department had solved its racial problems. The sanitation workers' struggle also differed from the police strike in a fundamental way. The sanitation workers of 1968 had fought first for recognition as human beings and as an organised workforce. The police already possessed formal authority, a recognised bargaining association, and a status in the city that sanitation labourers had never enjoyed. Reverend James Smith, a veteran organiser of the sanitation workers, said he did not see a direct parallel. The earlier workers, he explained, had been fighting for basic dignity before wages and benefits could even be addressed. Still, the success of public employee organisation after 1968 influenced what police and firefighters believed was possible. They had watched another municipal workforce demonstrate that the city could be pressured through collective action. By the 1970s, police officers were more professionalised, more conscious of comparisons with departments elsewhere, and more willing to demand recognition of that status. Historical analysis of the strike describes the conflict as the result of local grievances, national union trends, political obstacles, and an administration with limited experience managing organised public safety employees. The men on the picket line did not discuss all of that in academic language. They spoke about paychecks. They spoke about insurance. They spoke about the mayor. They spoke about being pushed around. They spoke about whether their union meant anything if the city could reject its demands and then order everyone back to work. At home, their families lived with the consequences. A striking officer was not receiving the security that normally came with a municipal job. Chandler's declaration that the officers had resigned threatened wages, pensions, seniority, medical benefits, and careers. Some officers had mortgages and children. Some had spent years building toward retirement. A dismissal could destroy more than 1 month's income. Their spouses had reason to be angry with the city and frightened by the strike at the same time. A wife might agree that her husband deserved better pay while wondering whether he would have a job next week. She might listen to him describe loyalty to the other officers and then look at bills waiting on the kitchen table. Children could hear adults discussing whether the family would need to move or whether a parent might be arrested. The public saw men shouting outside headquarters. Their households saw the uncertainty afterward. Some officers probably doubted the walkout almost immediately. Group action creates an appearance of agreement that may not exist privately. A man can stand on a picket line because he believes in the cause, because he fears his co-workers, because he expects a quick settlement, or because turning back feels more dangerous than continuing. After several days, the reasons may change. An officer who walked out over wages might remain out because the mayor threatened dismissal. Another might stay because friends had been arrested. Someone who regretted the strike could still decide that returning alone would leave him isolated when the rest of the department eventually came back. By the middle of the week, pride and fear were carrying the dispute alongside economics. A prominent Memphis attorney later argued that both unions were trying to prove they could not be pushed around. He believed inexperienced labour leaders and city officials had allowed ordinary negotiating hostility to become personal. Each side treated insults and threats as matters that required retaliation. That assessment may sound dismissive, but it helps explain why the strike continued when the financial gap had narrowed. The participants were defending their own versions of authority. Chandler had to show that an elected government could not be forced to surrender by armed public employees. The officers had to show that the city could not dismiss their organisation and still expect their obedience. Union leaders had to recover control of a membership that had rejected their advice. Every person involved feared what backing down would mean the next time a contract was negotiated. By August 16th, the original salary differences had been overshadowed by the length of the agreement, arbitration, reinstatement, and protection from reprisals. The men had walked out over compensation and respect. They now needed a settlement that would allow them to return without appearing to confess that the walkout had been pointless. The city needed the same thing in reverse. It required a way to restore the department without admitting that the strike had succeeded. That was why the officers behind the uniforms mattered more than the percentages alone. They were not a single group acting from one motive. They were patrolmen worried about household costs, union members testing a young organisation, police officers struggling with the conflict between labour rights and public duty, white and black employees temporarily joined by a common contract, and angry men responding to pressure from one another. Some behaved responsibly. Some used threats and obstruction. Some tried to return. Some hardened as the city threatened to replace them. Together they had created a crisis that none of them could end individually. Outside the negotiating rooms, Memphis residents continued to see picket signs and empty patrol assignments. Inside the dispute, the officers were waiting for a proposal that addressed more than wages. They needed protection for their jobs, continued recognition of their union, and some assurance that future disagreements would not place them in the same position again. Mayor Chandler needed evidence that the law still mattered, and that the city retained control of its departments. Between those demands stood the people trying to negotiate, and their task was becoming harder with every public threat, arrest, rejected offer, and hour under curfew. The next movement would not begin in a patrol car or on a picket line. It would begin inside City Hall, where officials and labour representatives had to turn anger into contract language before the temporary system holding Memphis together began to fail. The people trying to negotiate had to turn anger into contract language before the temporary system holding Memphis together began to fail. Outside those meetings, the city had already entered a different kind of schedule, one measured by curfew announcements, guard deployments, union votes, court orders, fire alarms, and the number of hours remaining until darkness. The first night began late on Thursday, August 10th, when striking officers left their assignments at approximately 11 o'clock. Most of the patrol officers and sergeants normally responsible for street protection joined the walkout. Pickets formed outside police stations. Access was blocked at some locations. City property was damaged, and officers who remained on duty were threatened. By the time many Memphis residents woke on Friday morning, the strike was no longer a possibility being discussed at a bargaining table. It was an active emergency. Mayor Wyeth Chandler responded by declaring a state of civil emergency and ordering a curfew from 8 in the evening until 6 the next morning. The starting time would later be moved to 10, but during the opening days, Memphis residents were told to finish their business, leave public streets, and return home before much of the summer evening had passed. An 8 o'clock curfew in August arrives before a city feels ready for night. The sun may be low, but the pavement still holds the heat. Stores remain open, families are still eating, workers are completing shifts, restaurants are preparing for the customers who normally arrive after sunset. Children are outside because the temperature has finally become more tolerable. Then the clock moves closer to 8, and those activities have to stop. On the first evening, people did not yet know what the curfew would look like in practice. They had questions about who could travel, what identification was required, whether officers or soldiers would stop every car, and what would happen to someone delayed at work. Essential workers were allowed to move, but they had to be prepared to explain why they were outside. Hospital employees carried badges, utility workers carried identification. Journalists moved through checkpoints with credentials. Other residents learned that an ordinary trip across town could become a conversation with armed men under emergency orders. The curfew removed most people from public spaces, but it did not remove the reasons people sometimes needed the police. Arguments still began in homes, cars still collided, businesses still discovered broken windows, people still became intoxicated, frightened, angry, or injured. The difference was that fewer regular patrol officers were available to answer. Police supervisors, non-striking officers, Shelby County Sheriff's deputies, and Tennessee National Guard personnel attempted to cover the city. The arrangement gave Memphis visible protection, but visible protection was not the same as normal service. A guard patrol could move along a major road and discourage trouble. A sheriff's deputy could respond to a serious call. A police supervisor could return to street duty. None of those measures recreated the thousands of small decisions normally made across a full department during a night shift. Calls had to be ranked more severely. A person with a weapon received attention before someone reporting missing property. A violent disturbance came before a complaint about noise. A burglary in progress mattered more than a burglary discovered several hours after it occurred. This kind of prioritization always existed, but the strike made it more obvious. Residents who had once assumed that an officer would eventually arrive began to understand that eventually might now mean much later, or not at all. The first night remained quieter than the worst predictions. There were no reports of the entire city falling into uncontrolled violence. The curfew reduced traffic, businesses closed, residents stayed behind locked doors, patrols were visible enough to discourage some opportunistic crime. That calm was useful to Chandler because it suggested that Memphis could continue functioning without giving the strikers everything they wanted. It was also useful to the emergency personnel trying to cover the streets. Fewer people outside meant fewer accidents, fewer disputes in public places, and fewer situations requiring immediate intervention. The calm did not remove the fear. People listened more carefully to sounds outside. A car moving slowly along a residential street attracted attention. Shouting in the distance seemed more serious. Smoke above a roof brought memories of the firefighters' strike 6 weeks earlier, when more than 200 fires had been reported during the first 24 hours and the city had imposed another curfew. Memphis entered the second night knowing that the police walkout would not end as quickly as some residents had hoped. A state judge had ordered the strikers back to work. Mayor Chandler gave them a deadline and warned that those who did not return would be removed from the payroll. Their own union president urged them to report for duty. They remained outside. Non-union police, supervisors, and sheriff's deputies continued patrolling, while the strike moved into its third day. The city still appeared controlled, but visitors were already changing their plans. The first anniversary of Elvis Presley's death was approaching, and people who might have travelled to Graceland were hearing that Memphis was under curfew, with most of its patrol force off duty. The effect could be seen in hotel reservations, restaurant expectations, entertainment schedules, and the number of visitors arriving near the Presley estate. Graceland's security chief acknowledged that people were staying away, despite official claims that the city remained safe. This created another kind of uncertainty. City officials needed to reassure the country that Memphis was open and functioning. If they admitted that the streets were unsafe, they would encourage panic and strengthen the strikers' argument that the city could not operate without them. The strikers needed the public to recognise their importance. If residents concluded that soldiers, deputies and supervisors could replace the patrol force indefinitely, the officers would lose much of their bargaining power. Both sides therefore watched the same quiet streets and described them differently. The mayor could say the curfew was working. The officers could say the curfew itself proved their value. A city that must send residents home, deploy troops, close businesses early, and discourage visitors has not replaced normal policing. It has reduced normal life until the remaining police resources are enough to manage it. The third night brought a harder confrontation. Approximately 60 striking police officers were arrested outside Central Police Headquarters for violating the curfew after shots were reportedly fired into the air. They were later released on their own recognizance. At the same time, Police Association President David Barker was unable to persuade the rank-and-file officers to return. When he tried to address them, he was shouted down. The scene outside headquarters showed how far the strike had moved beyond normal union leadership. The men being arrested were police officers who understood curfew enforcement. Some had probably arrested other people for refusing to obey lawful commands. They knew how an officer approached a crowd, how warnings were issued, and how people were taken into custody. Now they were on the receiving end. For the deputies and non-striking personnel carrying out the arrests, the situation was equally uncomfortable. The people being placed under arrest were professional colleagues. Some had worked beside one another at emergencies. They belonged to the same wider law enforcement community, but one group was enforcing the city's order while the other refused to accept it. No serious violence followed, but the possibility remained. National Guard troops had been instructed to keep their M16 rifles unloaded during ordinary duties. The decision reflected a desire to maintain order without creating an unnecessarily threatening military presence. Approximately 1,200 guardsmen were in Memphis by the fourth night, many assigned to police precincts and fire stations. Their unloaded rifles did not make the streets look normal. A military uniform communicates something different from a police uniform. Police are part of the permanent city. Guardsmen arrive because the permanent system is unable to handle events alone. For residents who remembered Memphis in 1968, the difference carried added weight. They had seen National Guard troops during the sanitation strike, and again after Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. Military vehicles and armed men were connected to curfews, civil disorder, and racial tension. In 1978, the Guard was present because of a labour dispute involving police officers, but the streets did not forget earlier uses of force simply because the cause had changed. Some residents felt protected by the patrols, others felt watched. The fourth night became more serious when Memphis firefighters joined the walkout. Until then, the city could at least rely on its regular fire service while struggling to provide police coverage. Once firefighters left their stations, Memphis faced the loss of both emergency systems at the same time. The walkout involved rank-and-file firefighters defying their own leaders and court orders, just as the police had done. The city's public safety dispute was no longer confined to one union or one department. The Guard's mission changed immediately. More troops were assigned to secure fire stations. Supervisory firefighters and replacement personnel attempted to keep equipment operating. County deputies continued police duties while military personnel guarded facilities and supported emergency crews. The city was not left with no fire protection, but its capacity was reduced. Fire created a more direct fear than many police calls because a delay of several minutes could destroy a building. A property crime could be investigated later. A house already burning could not wait for negotiations to finish. Residents checked stoves, wiring, cigarettes, heaters, and anything else that might produce a flame. Business owners looked at extinguishers that had previously been ignored. People who heard sirens wondered whether a full crew was responding, or whether an improvised team was trying to perform the work. There was also fear of deliberate fires. During the July firefighters' strike, Memphis had experienced 5 times its normal daily number of fires, with many suspected of being intentionally set. That history made every column of smoke during the August walkout seem connected to the emergency, even when there was no proof. The fifth night brought more arrests and the threat of a much wider labour shutdown. 44 firefighters and 22 police officers were arrested for curfew violations. The firefighters' union leadership, which had initially faced wildcat action, made the walkout official after the arrests. The Memphis Education Association announced that teachers would honour picket lines if they appeared at schools. Labour leaders representing tens of thousands of workers began discussing the possibility of a general strike. That possibility changed the scale of the crisis. A police and fire strike was already difficult. A general strike could affect transportation, offices, factories, schools, deliveries, sanitation, and private businesses throughout the metropolitan area. Union leaders spoke of solidarity. Chandler's critics accused him of trying to weaken organised labour throughout Memphis. The mayor's supporters argued that yielding to public safety employees would allow any essential workforce to force financial concessions by placing the city in danger. Most residents had no control over either argument. They needed to know whether schools would open, whether garbage would be collected, whether they could reach work, and whether the curfew would continue. Sanitation services briefly deteriorated. On one day, only 6 of the city's 248 sanitation trucks reportedly operated. Garbage that had become politically important during the 1968 strike again appeared as a sign of municipal conflict. By the following day, the full fleet returned to service, preventing another department's dispute from becoming permanent. The uncertainty moved through workplaces in quiet conversations. Would teachers walk out? Would bus drivers honour picket lines? Would factory workers stay home? Would the city close completely? The threat of a general strike did not need to become real to have an effect. Employers and workers still had to prepare for it. Mayor Chandler presented a mediation proposal to the City Council. Federal mediators would choose between the city's final offer and the union's final offer, but the employees would have to return to work first. If the mediators selected the union's proposal, Chandler suggested that voters might be asked to approve a sales tax increase to pay for it. Labour officials rejected the idea as unrealistic and insulting. The disagreement no longer concerned only how much officers and firefighters would receive. It concerned who would decide, how long the contract would last, whether arbitration would be binding, and whether returning strikers would face punishment. Each night under curfew increased the cost of failing to settle. Restaurants lost evening customers, music performances and film events were cancelled. The Elvis Presley Film Festival was suspended while fans arriving for the anniversary found a city whose nightlife had been shut down. For the people gathering near Graceland, the strike was difficult to avoid. More than 10,000 fans would pass through the estate to visit Presley's grave, but a planned memorial concert was cancelled. Memphis was receiving international attention for an anniversary it had expected to manage through tourism and remembrance. Instead, reports also described arrests, soldiers, curfews, and labour conflict. The 6th night began with a change that suggested conditions might be improving. The curfew was moved back from 8 to 10 in the evening. Officials described the adjustment as evidence that tension was easing. Businesses gained 2 more hours. Residents had more time to travel, eat, shop, and visit before returning home. Then, at 12:33 in the morning, the electricity failed across Memphis. The entire city went dark. Air conditioners stopped in the August heat. Traffic signals disappeared. Streetlights went out. Homes lost television and radio broadcasts unless residents had battery-powered equipment. Telephones at the utility company began ringing faster than operators could answer. For 3 hours, a city already living without most of its police and firefighters had to operate without power. At first, no one knew why. The blackout could have been an accident. It could have been sabotage connected to the strike. It could have been the beginning of a coordinated attack on city infrastructure. Residents had spent nearly a week learning that another disruption might arrive at any moment, and the darkness made every rumour easier to believe. Police radios carried reports of scattered looting. Emergency personnel moved through streets without traffic signals or normal lighting. Hospitals relied on backup generators. Guardsmen and deputies had to watch commercial areas where alarms and security systems might not be functioning properly. The atmosphere was described as graveyard-like, but the darkness did not make Memphis silent. There were vehicle engines, radio traffic, voices, sirens, and the noise of utility crews trying to restore service. People stood near windows, neighbours spoke across porches, families searched for flashlights and candles. A blackout during an ordinary week can feel like an inconvenience, or even a temporary break from routine. A blackout during a police and fire strike feels like the removal of another layer of protection. The cause turned out to be neither union sabotage nor a planned criminal operation. A 29-year-old private security guard named Richard David Hyder admitted throwing switches at a major utility substation while intoxicated. Authorities said there was no apparent connection between his actions and the strike. Power was restored around 3 in the morning, and Hyder was arrested. The explanation was almost absurd in its simplicity. One intoxicated man had turned an already nervous city completely dark. His action exposed a problem larger than the blackout itself. During the emergency, the National Guard had moved personnel away from the utility substation to strengthen security at police and fire facilities. A private security company had supplied the guard who caused the outage. Resources had been shifted to cover one weakness, and another weakness had appeared. That was how the strike was affecting Memphis by the 6th night. Every replacement created another gap. Deputies assigned inside the city had fewer resources for their usual county duties. Guardsmen protecting fire stations were not protecting utility sites. Supervisors driving patrol cars were not performing their normal administrative work. Private guards filled spaces left by soldiers. Employees worked longer shifts while businesses lost money and residents altered their lives. The system held, but it was being stretched sideways. The blackout also demonstrated how quickly people interpreted new events through the labour dispute. Before the cause was known, sabotage seemed possible because distrust had become the normal condition. Strikers distrusted the mayor. The mayor distrusted union leadership. Rank-and-file officers distrusted their own president. Residents distrusted official assurances that everything was under control. City leaders feared that any serious incident would prove their emergency plan inadequate. Union members feared that several quiet nights would persuade the public that their work could be replaced. Even the crime figures became part of the argument. Contemporary reports described relatively few arrests during parts of the strike and said the crime rate appeared low. Motorists reportedly drove more carefully, perhaps because the military presence and curfew made people more cautious. That did not mean nothing happened. There were reports of looting during the blackout. Fires continued. Residents later remembered seeing buildings burn and emergency crews operating under unusual conditions. Some offences may never have been reported because people assumed no one would respond. Others may have been delayed, misclassified, or handled without the documentation produced by normal patrol operations. Official numbers could describe only what entered the weakened system. A shopkeeper who discovered a missing property after reopening might file a report days later. A family dealing with an argument might decide not to call. A person violating the curfew could remain unnoticed because officers were dealing with something more serious. The absence of a recorded crisis was not proof that every neighbourhood felt secure. By the 7th night, the quiet had become exhausting. Residents knew the curfew procedure. Workers knew which documents to carry. Businesses knew how early to close. Guardsmen knew their posts. The extraordinary had acquired a routine, but no one wanted that routine to become permanent. The cost of the National Guard deployment was estimated at roughly $65,000 per day. Governor Ray Blanton criticised Chandler and urged him to accept binding arbitration. He warned that Memphis would be billed about $1 million for Guard deployments associated with the 1968 emergency, the July fire strike, and the current crisis. Those figures weakened the argument that refusing the union's demands was automatically saving taxpayers' money. The city was paying for soldiers, overtime, emergency operations, lost revenue, and disrupted services. Private businesses were losing income that would never be recovered. Visitors who cancelled trips might not return later. The economic damage was spread across thousands of people who had no seat at the negotiating table. City council members increased pressure on Chandler. Councilman John Ford argued that Memphis could afford the employees' proposed raise more easily than it could afford the continuing strike. The unions also faced increasing pressure. Every additional day risked public sympathy. Officers and firefighters might be seen less as underpaid workers and more as men willing to endanger residents. Threats against returning officers, obstruction at stations, and curfew arrests made it harder to present the walkout as a completely disciplined labour action. Families of strikers had spent a week wondering whether the city would carry out its threats of dismissal. personnel officials had already begun processing the strikers as employees who had resigned. The longer the dispute continued, the harder reinstatement might become. Negotiators returned to serious discussions. By then, the central differences involved a 1-year or 2-year contract, the size and timing of pay increases, arbitration, and protection against reprisals. Attorneys for the police and firefighters met with Chandler for several hours, while union representatives remained cautious about describing progress. Outside, Memphis entered another night without knowing whether the people in those rooms would succeed. The 8th night did not feel like the first. The first had been filled with surprise. The 8th carried fatigue. The city had learned that it could survive without ordinary patrols, but survival required restrictions that could not continue indefinitely. It required residents to remain indoors, businesses to lose money, military personnel to occupy civilian streets, supervisors to work outside their normal roles, and surrounding agencies to provide support. The 8 nights had not produced the total lawlessness predicted by the most frightened residents. They had produced something less dramatic and more revealing. Memphis had become a smaller version of itself. Its evenings were shorter, its streets were emptier. Its choices were narrower. People avoided activities that might create risk. Businesses stopped operating at the hours when they were most needed. Visitors stayed away. Workers carried documents proving their right to travel. Public life contracted until the reduced emergency services could contain it. That was the real method by which the city remained under control. Memphis did not fully replace its police and firefighters. It reduced Memphis. By August 18th, the pressure had reached the point where both sides needed a way out. The officers and firefighters had shown that the city could not dismiss their labour as ordinary. Chandler had shown that he could maintain enough control to avoid immediate surrender. Neither side had achieved a complete victory, and both had accumulated reasons to stop. The final agreement would return most of the roughly 1,100 police officers and 1,400 firefighters to duty, lift the curfew, and allow approximately 1,500 National Guard troops to leave. Before any of that could happen, the settlement had to pass through City Hall, union meetings, and one last period of confusion, in which even the announcement of an agreement did not guarantee that the mayor would accept it. The streets were waiting for an answer, but the decision now belonged to the people who had spent 8 days arguing over who controlled them. The streets were waiting for an answer, but the decision now belonged to the people who had spent 8 days arguing over who controlled them. City Hall was not separated from the emergency outside. Every negotiation took place with the knowledge that soldiers were standing at police precincts. Businesses were closing early, union members were being arrested, and residents were arranging their lives around a curfew. Each failed meeting meant another night of emergency operations. Each public statement could send hundreds of angry employees back to a picket line with less willingness to compromise. Mayor Wyeth Chandler occupied the most visible position in the dispute. He had to manage the police strike, the firefighters' walkout, the National Guard deployment, the curfew, pressure from the city council, criticism from organised labour, and the possibility that other municipal workers might join the confrontation. He also had to appear in control. That requirement shaped much of what happened inside City Hall. A mayor can negotiate privately, but he governs publicly. His words are heard by workers, taxpayers, council members, business owners, state officials, and political opponents. An offer that seems reasonable in a closed meeting may be interpreted as surrender once it reaches the evening news. A threat intended to strengthen the city's position may make it harder for union representatives to persuade their members to return. Chandler was dealing with employees who carried badges, operated fire engines, and performed services that could not be suspended without immediate consequences. If he accepted their demands after they had walked out illegally, other public workers might conclude that emergency strikes were effective. If he refused to compromise, Memphis could remain under military-supported emergency rule for an unknown length of time. The mayor's position was therefore not simply that the city lacked money. He believed municipal authority itself was being tested. Tennessee law did not permit public employees to strike. Courts had issued orders directing the police and firefighters to return. Chandler argued that elected officials could not allow employees to ignore those orders and then obtain better terms because their absence created danger. From his perspective, that would reward the act that caused the emergency. The unions saw the matter differently. They believed the emergency demonstrated how important their labour was and how badly the city had mismanaged negotiations. They argued that returning before an agreement was secured would remove the only pressure capable of forcing the administration to respond. Both sides claimed to be protecting the public. The mayor said he was protecting residents from government controlled by illegal strikes. The unions said they were protecting the public by defending the people, expected to provide police and fire services under difficult conditions. Those arguments were larger than the remaining financial differences. By the middle of the strike, the police were seeking a one-year agreement with a 7% wage increase retroactive to July 1st. They also wanted binding arbitration by federal officials. Chandler favoured a 2-year agreement with a 6% increase in the first year and some improvement in fringe benefits. A comparison with similarly sized cities reportedly found that Memphis police and firefighters ranked relatively well in direct wages but poorly in benefits. The numbers suggested that a compromise should have been possible. A 1 percentage point difference does not usually explain soldiers in the streets. The real disagreement involved what came after the first raise. A 1-year contract would allow the unions to return to bargaining relatively soon. That mattered during a period of high inflation because a wage package could lose value quickly. A 2-year contract gave the city more predictability and reduced the chance that Memphis would face another public safety confrontation the following year. Binding arbitration created an even deeper conflict. Under binding arbitration, the parties would present their positions to a neutral outside decision-maker, whose ruling would determine the result. The unions considered that process protection against an administration they no longer trusted. Chandler resisted allowing an outside official to make decisions affecting the city's finances. The mayor could argue that the power to tax and spend belonged to elected government. The unions could answer that without a neutral procedure. The city could delay, reject, or weaken every proposal until employees had no useful remedy. There was also the question of what would happen to the strikers when they returned. Chandler had already said that officers who ignored his deadline would be considered to have resigned. The city personnel office began processing the absent employees accordingly. Telephone numbers were publicised for people interested in joining rapid training programs for police and fire work. The administration threatened to withdraw recognition from the unions as bargaining agents. These actions were meant to show that the mayor would not be forced into submission. They also created a problem for any settlement. It was not enough to agree on pay if more than 1,000 officers and firefighters no longer officially had jobs. Union negotiators needed assurances that members would be reinstated, that seniority and benefits would remain intact, and that participation in the strike would not lead to mass punishment. Chandler needed to avoid appearing to excuse everything that had occurred. The federal court record found that striking officers had blocked access to stations, damaged city property and threatened personnel who remained on duty. Some strikers had been arrested for violating the curfew. Shots had reportedly been fired into the air outside police headquarters. A complete promise of no discipline would tell residents that those actions carried no consequences. A broad program of punishment would make it nearly impossible to restore the departments. The eventual solution would distinguish participation in the walkout from serious criminal conduct. Most workers could return without reprisals, while people convicted of felonies involving violence or destruction of property could still lose their positions. That language had not yet been secured, and until it was, every striker had reason to worry about what returning might mean. City council members were watching Chandler closely. The council did not control every part of the emergency response, but it represented districts whose residents and businesses were paying for the conflict. Council members heard from restaurant owners losing evening customers, families concerned about safety, union supporters demanding intervention, and taxpayers worried about the cost of wages and the cost of the National Guard. Those pressures did not all point in the same direction. One resident might demand that the council support the mayor and refuse to reward illegal activity. Another might say the strike had already cost more than the wage increase necessary to end it. The continuing deployment of the National Guard made that second argument stronger. Governor Ray Blanton said the Guard cost approximately $65,000 per day and warned that Memphis would receive a large bill for deployments connected to the 1968 emergency, the July fire strike, and the August crisis. Councilman John Ford argued that the city could afford the employees' proposed raise more easily than it could afford the continuing walkout. The mayor could not treat this as pressure from the unions alone. The governor was criticising him. Council members were pressing him. Private businesses were losing money. Labour officials were discussing a general strike. Residents were challenging the curfew in federal court. On August 15th, Chandler appeared before the city council with a proposal designed to show movement without granting the unions everything they wanted. He suggested that federal mediators choose between the city's final offer and the union's final offer. This method, sometimes called final offer arbitration, would prevent the mediator from constructing a compromise between the two positions. One complete proposal would be selected. The plan had a condition. The employees had to return to work before mediation began. Chandler also proposed that if the mediators chose the union's more expensive package, the city could hold a referendum on increasing the local sales tax to pay for the difference. The proposal allowed the mayor to say he had accepted outside involvement while preserving several political advantages. The unions would surrender their immediate leverage by returning first. The mediators would choose between complete packages rather than writing their own agreement. If the union proposal won, voters might be asked to approve the tax needed to fund it. The financial responsibility would therefore be moved partly from City Hall to the electorate. Labour officials reacted with contempt. Tommy Powell, president of the local AFL-CIO Labour Council, called the proposal a farce. Union leaders saw it as an arrangement that required them to end the strike before receiving any guarantee of a satisfactory outcome. The possibility of a tax referendum made the proposal even less attractive, because wage increases could be placed before voters already frustrated by the emergency. A public vote on taxes would not occur in a neutral atmosphere. Residents had spent days under curfew. Businesses had lost revenue. Police and firefighters had defied court orders. Asking those same voters to approve a sales tax increase to fund the union offer could transform a labour contract into a referendum on the strike itself. The unions did not want their members' compensation decided by public anger. Chandler did not want an arbitrator spending city money without public accountability. The mediation proposal failed to produce an immediate settlement, but it showed that the mayor's position was changing. Earlier, he had said he would not resume police negotiations and intended to ask the council to withdraw recognition from the Memphis Police Association. When he presented the mediation plan, that threat was not raised. The omission mattered. It suggested that City Hall was moving away from an attempt to destroy the unions and toward an attempt to end the strike without losing authority. Union leaders were under their own pressure to find a settlement. The police walkout had begun as a rank-and-file revolt. Association President David Barker had urged members to return and had been shouted down. The firefighters' second walkout of the summer also began without full leadership control before the union executive board made it official after members were arrested. This meant negotiators could not simply sign an agreement and assume the members would follow. They had to bring back terms that could survive a union vote. The members had already rejected advice from their own leaders. They had risked arrest and dismissal. Some had spent days outside stations while their families worried about lost wages and jobs. A proposal that looked like a return to the position before the strike would be difficult to sell. Union attorneys therefore became especially important. They could negotiate details without carrying the same visible political role as the mayor or the rank-and-file leaders. They could test language, discuss reinstatement, and determine whether a compromise on contract length or pay could be presented as a meaningful gain. By August 16th, attorneys for the police and firefighters met with Chandler for nearly 3 hours. Reports suggested that the unions were prepared to return if the mayor accepted 1-year contracts, a 7% wage increase, and protection from reprisals. The salary gap had become less important than the length of the agreements and the consequences of the walkout. The meeting took place while Memphis was recovering from the citywide blackout. That event had strengthened the argument for urgency. Even though the power failure was caused by an intoxicated private security guard and had no apparent connection to the strike, it showed how vulnerable the emergency system had become. Resources had been reassigned, private guards had replaced military personnel at some sites, and one man had been able to throw the city into darkness for hours. Inside City Hall, no one could assume the next unexpected event would end as harmlessly. A major fire, a riot, a fatal confrontation at a picket line, or a violent incident during the curfew could change the entire dispute. The longer the strike continued, the more likely it became that something unrelated to wages would decide the outcome. Negotiators had to work before chance made the decision for them. The city council's role increased as the administration searched for an arrangement that could be approved politically. Chandler could bargain, but a contract involving public money required support beyond the mayor's office. Council members could give him room to compromise or make every concession look like defeat. They were not a single united group. Some were frequent critics of the mayor, some were closer to Labour, others were concerned about the precedent created by public safety strikes. Each understood that voters would later ask who had allowed Memphis to reach this point. Responsibility was being assigned even before the emergency ended. Union supporters blamed Chandler's confrontational style. The mayor's allies blamed inexperienced and undisciplined union leadership. Some observers concluded that both sides had allowed ordinary negotiating hostility to become personal. Attorney Charles Donaldson later described the dispute as a contest of one-upmanship, in which neither side wanted to back down, even though their positions on the central issues were not very far apart. That description fits the sequence of public threats. The unions rejected an offer. The mayor declared that the officers had resigned. The unions threatened broader labour action. The city discussed withdrawing recognition. The firefighters joined the strike. The mayor proposed mediation only after a return to work. Labour officials rejected the proposal publicly. Each move answered the previous one and created a new obstacle. One-upmanship is dangerous in any labour dispute, but it becomes especially dangerous when the workers carry weapons or control emergency equipment. Neither side can speak casually because every threat has an operational meaning. When Chandler said he would replace the police, the city had to prepare an actual replacement system. When union officials discussed a general strike, schools, sanitation, transportation, and private industry had to consider what would happen if workers honoured picket lines. The language itself created costs. By August 17th, the federal court issued its decision in the challenge to the curfew. The American Civil Liberties Union of West Tennessee and plaintiff Mary Wilder argued that the emergency order violated constitutional rights and had not been properly imposed. The court refused to grant preliminary relief, finding that the strike, threats to officers, damage to property, and risk of serious disorder provided a sufficient basis for the mayor's action. The curfew had already been adjusted from 8 in the evening to 10. The ruling gave Chandler legal support for maintaining emergency restrictions. It did not give him a permanent solution. A mayor could lawfully keep residents indoors for part of the night during a genuine emergency. That did not mean he could govern Memphis indefinitely through curfew orders, National Guard patrols, and temporary staffing. The court decision protected the response while the political process tried to end the cause. Negotiations continued into the final stage with both sides adjusting their demands. The police had wanted 7% retroactive to July 1st. The final terms provided a 6.1% raise retroactive to July 5th, followed by an additional $22.50 per month beginning the next April. Firefighters received 6% retroactive to July 5th and an additional $30 per month the following April. Both departments could receive a 7.5% increase in October 1979 if a survey justified it. The structure of the package allowed each side to claim something. The city avoided granting the full immediate 7% demand in the exact form requested. Employees received retroactive increases, later monthly additions, and the possibility of another raise. The agreement lasted 2 years, which matched Chandler's preference more closely than the union's demand for one. The union secured reinstatement without general reprisals, which was essential after the mayor had declared the strikers resigned. It was a compromise, but it had to be described carefully. No one wanted to tell hundreds of police officers and firefighters that they had spent 8 days under threat of dismissal merely to accept the mayor's original offer. No one wanted to tell taxpayers that illegal strikes had forced the city to surrender. The language surrounding the agreement became almost as important as the agreement itself. Union leaders could say the workers had obtained retroactive increases, additional future money, job protection, and a procedure for considering later raises. Chandler could say he had preserved a 2-year contract, resisted the exact demands made at the beginning, and maintained public order throughout the emergency. The final settlement also drew a line between ordinary participation and serious misconduct. The police and firefighters would be reinstated without reprisals despite violating court orders and state law. But anyone convicted of a felony involving violence or destruction of city property could still be dismissed. That distinction allowed the departments to be restored without pretending that every act committed during the strike was acceptable. The unions then had to present the package to their memberships. This was not a ceremonial vote. Rank-and-file workers had already demonstrated that they could reject their leaders. They could refuse the settlement and continue the walkout. The emergency might then enter another weekend, with guard units remaining in place and political support shifting unpredictably. Police and firefighters gathered separately to hear the terms. They had to compare the agreement not with an ideal contract, but with the risks of continuing. The city had maintained basic order. The guard remained available. Public frustration was growing. The threat of mass dismissal might or might not be carried out, but every additional day made it more believable. The members approved the 2-year contracts. For a brief period, it appeared that the crisis was over. Then Chandler introduced one final moment of confusion. After the unions accepted the settlement, the mayor announced that he was dissatisfied with the contract and might refuse to approve it. The reaction moved quickly from celebration to uncertainty. Workers who had just voted to return were again unsure whether they had an agreement. The mayor eventually signed. The hesitation reflected the pattern that had defined the dispute. Even when the practical issues had been resolved, neither side wanted to be seen stepping aside for the other. Public toughness had become a habit. Chandler may also have been responding to the exact cost, the reinstatement provisions, or the political appearance of accepting terms after repeatedly declaring the workers had resigned. Whatever his immediate concern, refusing the agreement after union approval would have risked restarting the strike at the moment Memphis was prepared to resume normal life. The contract moved forward. The curfew was lifted. Approximately 1,500 National Guardsmen were expected to leave. Most of the roughly 1,100 police officers and 1,400 firefighters were scheduled to return to duty. City Hall had produced an agreement, but it had not produced a clear winner. The unions had not received every term they demanded. The mayor had not succeeded in replacing the strikers or eliminating their organisations. The city had spent heavily to maintain emergency services. Businesses had lost revenue. Workers had risked careers. Residents had lived under restrictions. The departments would return with many of the same people, supervisors, union representatives and political leaders who had spent the previous week threatening one another. A signed contract could determine wages and benefits. It could not immediately restore trust. The crisis also pushed Memphis toward a permanent change in how municipal labour disputes would be handled. In September 1978, the city adopted a charter amendment prompted by the danger created by public employee strikes. The amendment required procedures for arbitration of economic issues after a bargaining impasse had remained deadlocked for 7 consecutive days. That later action showed that City Hall understood the settlement had ended the immediate emergency without fixing the process that produced it. Future officials needed a mechanism that operated before officers left patrol cars and firefighters left stations. Future unions needed a way to move a deadlocked dispute toward a decision without depending on an illegal strike. The 8 days had demonstrated what happened when neither side trusted negotiation enough to accept its limits. By the morning of August 18th, the paperwork was nearly complete, the votes had been counted, and instructions were moving through the departments. Uniforms that had hung unused for a week were taken out again. Officers prepared to report to precincts where supervisors and deputies had covered their assignments. Firefighters returned to stations guarded by soldiers. The same doors that had been blocked by pickets would open for the returning employees. The same streets that had emptied under curfew would remain active after dark. Memphis had reached the point where ending the strike required more than announcing an agreement. Thousands of workers, soldiers, business owners and residents had to reverse the habits they had learned during the emergency, and the first sign of that reversal would come when patrol cars began leaving the stations again. The first sign of the return was not a speech from City Hall. It was the sight of uniformed officers entering police stations they had refused to enter for more than a week. On Friday, August 18th, 1978, most of Memphis's striking police officers and firefighters began reporting for duty under the terms of the new 2-year agreements. The curfew was lifted, and approximately 1,500 Tennessee National Guardsmen who had helped police the city and protect emergency facilities prepared to leave. Most of the roughly 1,100 police officers and 1,400 firefighters involved in the dispute were expected back at work that day. The return did not happen at one exact moment across the city. Officers arrived according to assignments and shift schedules. Some drove themselves to precincts. Others appeared in groups after union meetings and final instructions. Firefighters returned to stations where supervisory personnel, replacement crews and guardsmen had tried to maintain service during the walkout. The buildings were familiar, but the circumstances were not. At police stations, officers passed through entrances that had recently been blocked by pickets. They entered rooms where supervisors had worked extended hours without them. They saw colleagues who had crossed the line, attempted to return earlier, or remained on duty throughout the strike. There was work to be done, but there were also memories from the previous 8 days. Some officers had been threatened for trying to report. Some had been arrested for violating the curfew. Others had stood outside headquarters while deputies and guardsmen performed duties that normally belonged to the department. Supervisors had watched members of their own force defy court orders and instructions from City Hall. A signed contract did not erase any of that. The first returning officers had practical matters to address. Equipment had to be checked. Patrol cars had to be reassigned. Radios, weapons, keys, reports, and duty rosters had to be placed back into normal use. Commanders needed to know how many officers had returned and which districts could resume regular coverage. For more than a week, Memphis had operated with a reduced and improvised police system. Non-union officers, supervisors, sheriff's deputies, and the National Guard had focused on serious incidents, curfew enforcement, checkpoints, and protection of public facilities. The restored department now had to move from emergency control back to ordinary policing. That meant responding again to the smaller calls that had been delayed or given lower priority. Residents had reported stolen property, broken windows, suspicious activity, damaged vehicles and other offences that could not compete with violent incidents during the strike. Some cases had been recorded but not investigated fully. Others had never been reported because residents assumed no regular officer would respond. Returning patrol officers would find that the city had accumulated unfinished business. There were reports to review, witnesses to contact, and neighbourhoods to revisit. Business owners wanted documentation for insurance claims. Residents wanted to know whether burglaries would be investigated. Detectives needed to determine which cases could still be pursued after evidence had been disturbed or time had passed. The department also had to restore its usual presence. For 8 nights, residents had grown accustomed to seeing military vehicles and sheriff's units on roads normally covered by Memphis police. Patrol officers now had to return to those same streets and make the familiar police car the main symbol of public authority again. This transition may sound simple, but the public had spent days learning a different set of habits. People had closed stores early. Parents had called children home well before dark. Essential employees had carried identification to pass checkpoints. Residents had limited unnecessary travel. Drivers had become more careful because the city was under emergency rules. The end of the curfew meant those restrictions were no longer legally necessary. It did not mean everyone immediately trusted that normal life had returned. A restaurant could stay open later, but the owner still had to decide whether customers would come. A musician could perform an evening set, but an audience that had cancelled plans might not appear. A parent could allow a teenager to remain outside after 10, but 8 nights of uncertainty might make that permission difficult to give. The city had changed its behaviour quickly when the emergency began. Reversing that behaviour took longer. Businesses had lost thousands of dollars in restaurant and entertainment receipts during the curfew. Those losses could not be recovered simply by reopening for normal hours. Food that had spoiled, reservations that had been cancelled, performances that had not occurred, and tourists who had stayed away belonged to the previous week. The strike had been especially damaging because it coincided with the first anniversary of Elvis Presley's death. Memphis had expected visitors to gather near Graceland, stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, buy souvenirs, and attend memorial events. Many came, but others were discouraged by news of the police walkout, fire strike, National Guard patrols, and nighttime curfew. The agreement could lift the restrictions, but it could not repeat the anniversary. Hotel rooms left empty on August 16th could not be sold again for that date. A cancelled concert could not be placed back into the week. A restaurant that had prepared for visitors could not recreate the customers who never arrived. The city's economic recovery therefore began with an immediate lesson. Public safety disputes affected people far beyond the workers and officials involved in the contract. The police officers returning to work also had to confront the question of how residents viewed them. Before the strike, the public could disagree about individual officers or department policies while still treating the police force as a permanent institution. The walkout had shown that the institution depended on employees who could decide not to work. Some residents sympathised with the officers' complaints about pay and benefits. They understood inflation and the difficulty of supporting a family on wages that had lost purchasing power. They believed the city had allowed negotiations to deteriorate and had treated public employees with unnecessary hostility. Others felt abandoned. They believed a police officer's duty was different from that of an ordinary employee. The authority to arrest, carry a weapon, and use force came with obligations that could not be suspended during a contract dispute. To these residents, leaving patrol assignments was not simply a labour tactic. It was a rejection of the public trust. Those feelings did not disappear when the patrol cars returned. An officer answering a call might meet a resident who was relieved to see him. The next person might ask where the department had been for the last week. A store owner might welcome the return of regular patrols while still blaming the officers for lost business. The same uniform now carried 2 recent meanings. It represented restored protection. It also reminded people that the protection had been withdrawn. The returning officers had their own grievances about the public response. Many believed residents had accepted the city's version of the dispute too easily. Officers felt that people wanted police protection without understanding the demands of police work or the inadequacy of their benefits. They had seen how quickly officials threatened to replace them after years of service. Some may also have resented the ease with which newspapers and political leaders described them as having abandoned the city. From their perspective, they had used a dangerous method because ordinary negotiation had failed. They believed the emergency proved that their work mattered enough to deserve better treatment. That belief could coexist with discomfort about what had happened. Not every officer had supported threats, obstruction, or damage at police stations. Not every striker had approved of shots being fired into the air or colleagues being intimidated. A large group acting together can include people with very different limits. When the strike ended, those differences remained inside the department. The agreement reinstated the police and firefighters without general reprisals, even though the strikes violated state law and court orders. Workers convicted of felonies involving violence or destruction of city property could still lose their jobs. That distinction was necessary to restore the departments, but it created difficult questions. What counted as ordinary strike activity? What conduct required internal investigation? Would threats against non-striking officers be pursued? Would supervisors remember who had remained loyal and who had walked out? Could a returning officer trust that future promotions, assignments, and discipline would not be affected by the strike? The contract could promise no general reprisals. It could not prevent every private judgment made inside the department. Police organisations depend heavily on trust between co-workers. Officers respond when another officer calls for help. They enter dangerous buildings together. They rely on partners and supervisors to make decisions under pressure. The strike had placed that trust under severe strain. An officer who stayed at work might believe the strikers had endangered him by reducing available backup. A striker might believe the officer who remained had weakened the union and benefited from the sacrifices of others. They now had to share patrol cars, locker rooms, roll calls, and emergency scenes. The fire department faced the same problem. Firefighting requires close coordination. Crew members enter smoke-filled buildings knowing that the people beside them will hold a hose, control a ladder, search another room, or help them escape. Disagreement over the strike could not be allowed to interfere with that work. The first emergency after the return would not wait for personal relationships to heal. When an alarm sounded, firefighters had to climb onto engines and operate as a crew. When a police dispatcher sent units to a violent call, officers had to respond regardless of who had crossed which line. Professional routine became part of the recovery. A returning officer put on the uniform, attended roll call, received an assignment, and entered a patrol car. Those actions did not resolve the labour dispute emotionally, but they provided a structure in which the department could function. The radios resumed their usual pattern. Dispatchers sent units to collisions, disturbances, burglaries, and medical emergencies. Officers acknowledged calls and reported their locations. Precinct commanders could once again distribute personnel across districts, instead of placing nearly everyone on the most urgent duties. Residents began seeing regular patrol cars in residential streets and commercial areas. The sight was ordinary enough that it might have passed without comment before August 10th. After the strike, people noticed. A patrol car parked outside a store showed that the police had returned. An officer directing traffic without military assistance showed that the emergency structure was being removed. A regular response to a minor accident suggested that the city could again spare personnel for routine service. The National Guard withdrawal was another visible sign. For 8 days, guardsmen had patrolled streets, supported deputies, protected police and fire facilities, and helped the city maintain order. Their presence had reassured some residents and disturbed others. It had also cost the state and city substantial amounts of money. As regular police and firefighters returned, guard units no longer needed to remain at every assigned location. Military personnel gathered equipment, received new orders, and prepared to leave Memphis. Vehicles that had become familiar at intersections and public buildings began disappearing. The departure did not produce the same dramatic images as the arrival. There was no single parade marking the end of the emergency. Soldiers simply stopped appearing at certain locations. A checkpoint was removed, a fire station no longer had a military guard, a patrol route returned to the police department. The city became less militarised through a series of absences. Residents who had been stopped during curfew could travel without carrying proof of essential employment. Streets remained active after 10 at night. Restaurants served later customers. Bars and music venues could operate closer to their normal schedules. The first unrestricted evening probably did not feel entirely normal. People had spent a week expecting the streets to empty. Now traffic continued. Customers remained seated. Workers left jobs without calculating whether they could reach home before the deadline. For some, the lifting of the curfew brought relief. For others, it removed a restriction that had also provided a sense of control. Empty streets had reduced opportunities for trouble and made unusual activity easy to notice. Restoring nightlife meant restoring crowds, arguments, accidents, and the normal demands placed on police. The officers returning to duty were tested immediately by the same activity residents had missed. Late-night traffic increased. Entertainment districts reopened. People gathered again. The city did not return only to pleasant routines. It returned to every ordinary problem that curfew had temporarily suppressed. The settlement itself gave police a 6.1% raise, retroactive to July 5th, and an additional $22.50 per month, beginning the following April. Firefighters received a 6% retroactive raise and another $30 per month beginning in April. Both groups could receive a further 7.5% increase in October 1979 if a salary survey justified it. These terms were more complicated than a simple victory or defeat. The police did not receive the exact one-year agreement and immediate 7% increase they had demanded. The city accepted retroactive raises, future monthly additions, reinstatement, and the possibility of another increase. Mayor Chandler preserved a 2-year contract, which gave the administration greater stability. The unions preserved their organisations and returned without the mass dismissals the mayor had threatened. The agreement allowed everyone to leave the crisis with at least one claim of success. That was politically useful because the return needed cooperation. If Chandler had described the settlement as the complete defeat of the unions, members might have resisted returning or renewed the dispute at the next opportunity. If union leaders had described it as the city's surrender, the mayor and council would have faced pressure to punish employees or limit bargaining rights. Public statements therefore emphasised restoration. The departments were operating again. The curfew was over. The guard was leaving. Memphis could resume normal business. Underneath those statements, officials were already considering how to prevent another emergency. The strike had shown that existing negotiations could reach an impasse without a trusted process for resolving it. Once the police and firefighters walked out, the city had only coercive responses: court orders, dismissal threats, emergency decrees, curfews, and military support. Those measures kept Memphis functioning, but they did not settle wages. The eventual settlement came through direct bargaining under extreme pressure. There was no guarantee that the same method would work the next time. On September 5, 1978, Memphis adopted a referendum ordinance proposing a charter amendment related to municipal labour disputes. The amendment was prompted by the threat that public employee strikes had posed to the lives, property and welfare of residents. It called for procedures allowing the city council or a council committee to arbitrate economic issues after negotiations had remained deadlocked for 7 consecutive days. The voters approved the amendment on November 7th. This later action was an admission that the city's previous system had failed. Officials could condemn the strike and still recognise that simply banning strikes was not enough. Employees needed a path for moving a contract dispute forward before frustration reached the point of a walkout. The amendment did not give workers an unrestricted right to strike. It attempted to create an earlier intervention, placing the city council into the process after a defined period of deadlock. That reform came after the badges returned, but its origin was visible in every part of the first day back. The city needed regular police protection. yet it also needed rules for dealing with the people who provided it. The strike had exposed another issue that no arbitration procedure could solve by itself: racial division within the departments and the city. The police and fire unions were predominantly white, although black employees also participated. Some white strikers claimed the walkout had brought members together across racial lines. Black labour figures and residents were less certain. The officers and firefighters were returning to the same departments they had left. Any discrimination in assignments, promotions, discipline, or workplace culture remained. A shared wage dispute could create temporary unity without changing those deeper conditions. The memory of 1968 also remained. Black sanitation workers had struck for union recognition and dignity, while police enforced the city's authority against them. 10 years later, police officers had used their own strike to force negotiations. Some residents saw hypocrisy. Some officers saw a common lesson about organised labour. Others believed the two events should not be compared, because the sanitation workers had faced more dangerous conditions, lower status, and a struggle for basic recognition that the police unions already possessed. The return of patrols did not settle that debate. Officers went back into neighbourhoods where residents remembered both events. The department had to exercise authority in communities whose views of the strike were shaped by earlier encounters with police. An officer might see himself as a worker who had defended his family's economic security. A resident might see the same man as a public official who had left the city and then returned with a raise. Neither interpretation disappeared when the officer answered the next call. Mayor Chandler also emerged from the crisis changed. He had maintained emergency control and avoided the uncontrolled disorder that many people feared. The federal court upheld his authority to impose the curfew during the emergency. He could argue that his refusal to yield immediately had protected the city's ability to govern. He had also been forced to reinstate employees he had declared resigned, preserve their unions, and sign a settlement after briefly suggesting he might reject it. His final hesitation caused confusion even after workers had approved the contracts. The moment captured the personal hostility that had prolonged the dispute. The practical agreement was ready, yet the struggle over who appeared to have won continued. When Chandler signed, he allowed the city to move forward. He did not remove the political consequences. Business owners could blame him for waiting too long. Union critics could say he had rewarded an illegal strike. Labour supporters could say his threats had turned a manageable negotiation into an emergency. The officers returning that morning were therefore entering not only their precincts, but a citywide argument over responsibility. Police departments usually prefer to present authority as settled. Orders move through a chain of command. Rules identify who may make decisions. Uniforms distinguish officers from civilians. The strike had shown that authority inside the department was not as simple as it appeared. Union leaders had lost control of members. Supervisors had remained at work while patrol officers walked out. Courts had issued orders that trained law enforcement personnel ignored. The mayor had declared employees dismissed, then reinstated them. For 8 days, the city's formal chain of authority had been challenged at nearly every level. Returning to work required everyone to behave as though that chain had been restored. At roll call, supervisors assigned officers to districts. Officers accepted those assignments. Dispatchers transmitted calls. Patrol units responded. These ordinary acts became evidence that the department could again follow its own structure. The public did not need every officer and supervisor to forgive one another before the next shift. It needed them to perform their duties. That performance gradually rebuilt confidence. A resident called the police and an officer arrived. A driver saw a patrol car and assumed traffic laws were being enforced. A business owner locked the store at the normal time rather than hours earlier. A firefighter answered an alarm with a full crew. Each routine response made the emergency less immediate. Memphis did not forget the strike in one morning. It simply stopped living under its rules. The curfew notices were removed. National Guard assignments ended. Picket lines disappeared from stations. Negotiations moved from daily crisis coverage into contract administration and political review. Residents returned to complaining about response times, traffic tickets, taxes, noise, and the other ordinary frustrations of city life. That return to complaint was part of normality. During the strike, people had asked whether anyone would answer at all. Afterward, they could again argue about how well the answer had been handled. The police badges had returned, but they no longer looked quite the same. They still represented legal authority. They still identified the people expected to respond when something went wrong. They now also represented labour. The men wearing them had shown that they could organise, bargain, disobey and withhold their work. Memphis had learned that police protection was both a public institution and a service performed by employees whose cooperation could not be taken for granted. The officers had learned something as well. Their absence gave them leverage, but it also exposed them to public anger, legal action, arrest and dismissal. A police strike could not remain a private dispute between a union and an employer. It immediately affected every person who depended on the city's emergency systems. The first morning back, therefore, did not provide a clean return to the time before August 10th. It began a new relationship between Memphis, its public safety employees, and the labour procedures that governed them. Patrol cars left the stations again. Fire engines stood ready with regular crews. Soldiers prepared to depart. Businesses opened with the expectation that the evening would continue past 10. The emergency was ending in practical terms. What remained was the question of what the city would remember from it, because events that dominate every street for 8 days can still disappear quickly once ordinary life becomes more convenient than examining what happened. What remained was the question of what Memphis would remember, because an event can control the life of a city for 8 days and still become difficult to find in the larger story of the country. The police strike began at approximately 11 o'clock on August 10th, 1978. Most of the patrol officers and sergeants responsible for ordinary police protection joined it. Strikers blocked access to police stations, damaged some city property, and threatened officers who remained at work. By the following morning, Mayor Wyeth Chandler had declared a civil emergency and imposed a nighttime curfew. For the people living through it, the event was not obscure. They saw National Guard vehicles in their neighbourhoods. They adjusted work schedules around the curfew. Restaurant owners lost customers. Hospital employees carried identification so they could travel at night. Families listened to reports about arrests, negotiations, fire alarms, union votes, and the possibility of a general strike. They lived through a citywide blackout while the police and firefighters were already off duty. They watched striking officers arrested for violating emergency rules that those same officers might normally have enforced. They heard that more municipal employees might refuse to cross picket lines. Then an agreement was reached, the badges returned, and ordinary routines began covering the emergency almost immediately. This is one reason the strike became easy to forget. There was no single scene that permanently defined it for the rest of the country. There was no widely remembered photograph comparable to the images of the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike. There was no national political leader assassinated during it. There was no building that became a lasting symbol of the crisis. The strike had soldiers, arrests, fires, threats, legal challenges, a blackout, and 8 nights under emergency restrictions. Yet it ended with municipal workers returning to their stations and patrol assignments under a negotiated contract. The conclusion looked administrative. Contracts were approved, pay raises were calculated, employees were reinstated, guardsmen left, the curfew ended. The administrative endings are often poor material for public memory. They resolve events without giving later generations a simple image through which to remember them. Memphis already carried the weight of another labour struggle. The 1968 sanitation workers' strike had brought Martin Luther King Jr. to the city. It produced the march in which violence broke out, the presence of National Guard troops, King's final speech, and his assassination at the Lorraine Motel. The signs carried by the sanitation workers declaring, "I am a man," became one of the most recognizable images in American labor and civil rights history. The 1978 police strike occurred 10 years later in the same city, involved public employees, brought the guard back into the streets and forced another curfew. But it did not possess the same moral clarity. The sanitation workers were low-paid black labourers demanding recognition, safety and dignity from a city that had long treated them as replaceable. The police officers of 1978 were armed public employees who already exercised legal authority over the population and belonged to a recognised bargaining organisation. Their complaints about pay, benefits, respect and union standing were real. The danger created by their walkout was also real. That combination made the story difficult to reduce to a familiar lesson. The officers were workers, but they were not ordinary workers. They were public servants, but that description did not remove their economic grievances. They were enforcing agents of the government who chose to disobey government orders. They demanded union rights while using the withdrawal of public protection as bargaining pressure. A simple account could describe them as irresponsible men who abandoned Memphis. Another could describe them as employees pushed into desperate action by an administration that did not respect them. Neither version explains the full event. Historical research conducted after the strike found that the conflict was not caused by wages alone. Economics mattered, but police officers and firefighters also believed the city administration had little respect for them or their unions. The departments had become more professional, and their employees expected that professional status to be recognised in bargaining. City officials had limited experience managing these newly organised public safety workforces, and communication between the two sides broke down. This made the 1978 walkouts part of a larger change in American policing. During much of the 20th century, police administrators promoted the idea that officers belonged to a disciplined public service separate from ordinary labour. Police were expected to follow a chain of command, avoid partisan organisation while on duty, and place loyalty to the department above workplace protest. As police departments expanded and professionalised, officers began paying closer attention to salaries, pensions, insurance, overtime, schedules, promotion systems, and comparisons with other cities. The badge did not prevent an officer's family from facing inflation. The authority to arrest someone did not guarantee good medical benefits. Professional expectations could even strengthen the argument for higher compensation. If cities wanted trained officers who accepted risk, followed complex procedures, and exercised judgment under pressure, those officers expected pay and benefits reflecting that responsibility. Police unionisation gave them a structure through which to make those demands. That development created a question cities across the country still had not answered clearly by the late 1970s. What should happen when police bargaining reaches an impasse? A private sector strike closes a factory or stops production. The public may suffer indirectly, but the employer usually bears the most immediate economic cost. A police strike works differently. The employer is the city, but the immediate pressure falls on residents. A person waiting for help during a burglary, assault, traffic collision, or domestic dispute has no role in negotiating the contract. Closing restaurants, imposing a curfew, and calling in soldiers harms businesses and workers who do not control the municipal budget. This gives public safety unions unusual bargaining power and creates unusual public hostility toward using it. Binding arbitration developed as one answer. Under that system, a neutral decision-maker can issue a settlement after negotiations fail, removing the need for police officers or firefighters to strike. Supporters argued that arbitration produced a final decision, reduced the danger of walkouts, balanced the power of employees and government, and allowed both sides to accept an outcome without publicly surrendering to the other. Critics objected that an arbitrator could commit public money without the same accountability faced by elected officials. Memphis had confronted this disagreement during the strike. The unions wanted outside arbitration because they no longer trusted the city's bargaining process. Chandler resisted allowing someone outside elected government to determine the cost of public contracts. After the strike, Memphis attempted to create its own answer. On September 5th, 1978, less than 3 weeks after the officers and firefighters returned, the City Council adopted an ordinance proposing a charter amendment on strikes by municipal employees. Voters approved it on November the 7th. The amendment declared that participation in a strike against the city threatened the lives, property and welfare of residents. It prohibited municipal employees from striking or leading a strike. It also required the City Council to establish a process for arbitration of economic disputes after negotiations had remained deadlocked for 7 consecutive days. The structure of that amendment shows what Memphis believed it had learned. The city did not legalize police strikes. It strengthened the rule against them. At the same time, it recognized that punishment alone could not prevent another crisis. Employees needed a process that began before frustration became a walkout. The 7-day deadlock provision attempted to create movement, while both sides were still at the bargaining table. The amendment contained both a warning and a concession. The warning was that municipal workers could not stop essential services without risking their jobs. The concession was that the city could not allow negotiations to remain stalled indefinitely and then expect employees to accept every result. This was one of the clearest long-term consequences of the 8-day strike. It changed the formal relationship between Memphis and its unions. A later historical study concluded that the lessons of 1978 eventually produced a more stable relationship between the city and its municipal employees. That did not mean labour conflict disappeared. It meant both sides had seen what uncontrolled escalation cost and had reasons to avoid repeating it. The settlement also helped establish that police officers could not be understood only as instruments of city authority. They were employees with collective interests. This did not settle whether they should possess the same labour rights as other workers. It made it impossible to ignore the question. When officers ask for better pay, they speak as employees. When they make arrests, they act as representatives of the state. When their unions support political candidates or negotiate disciplinary rules, those two roles overlap. The 1978 strike exposed that overlap in its most disruptive form. The public discovered that the police department was not a machine that continued operating simply because City Hall ordered it to do so. It depended on thousands of individual decisions to report for work, accept assignments, answer radios, and follow supervisors. The officers discovered that public recognition of their importance did not automatically create sympathy for a strike. Residents could agree that police work was necessary, and conclude that necessity was the reason officers must never leave their posts. The city discovered that replacement manpower could prevent complete collapse, but could not reproduce normal service. National Guard troops could stand at intersections, guard stations, and support sheriff's deputies. They could help enforce a curfew and discourage public disorder. They could not instantly acquire the local knowledge, legal experience and routine relationships of a municipal patrol force. Memphis remained under control largely because public life was reduced. The curfew removed residents from the streets. Businesses closed. Events were cancelled. Visitors stayed away. People postponed activities, travelled earlier, and avoided unnecessary risks. The city did not prove that police patrols were unimportant. It proved that enough soldiers, deputies, restrictions, and private caution could temporarily prevent the absence of patrols from becoming total disorder. That distinction was not always preserved in later accounts. Supporters of Chandler could point to the low level of major disorder and say the city had resisted union pressure successfully. Supporters of the officers could point to the curfew, guard deployment, economic losses, and emergency measures as evidence that Memphis could not operate normally without them. Both claims contained part of the truth. Memphis survived the strike. It did not live normally through it. The event also left a more uncomfortable legacy within organised labour. The police and fire unions were predominantly white, although black employees participated in the dispute. 10 years earlier, many of the institutions represented by those uniforms had enforced city authority against black sanitation workers. In 1978, white police officers and firefighters used mass defiance, picket lines, union solidarity, and refusal to obey court orders to advance their own workplace demands. Some black Memphians saw hypocrisy. Police officers who had been positioned against labour protest in 1968 now expected the public to understand them as workers. The same legal and political arguments once used against sanitation employees could now be directed at officers and firefighters. The comparison was not complete. Sanitation workers had struggled for basic union recognition, safety, and human dignity under conditions of severe racial inequality. Police officers possessed authority, institutional standing, and bargaining organisations. Their work also carried a direct public safety responsibility that garbage collection did not carry in the same immediate form. Even so, the two strikes belonged to the same changing world of municipal labour. After 1968, Memphis had expanded recognition of public employee unions. Police and firefighters organised during the following years. By 1978, those employees were testing what recognition meant when bargaining failed. A later criminal justice history of the event emphasised that both the social and economic life of the city were affected because police and fire protection could not be easily replaced. The strike therefore connected two parts of American history that are often discussed separately. One is the history of organised labour, the other is the history of policing. Labour history usually focuses on miners, factory workers, transportation employees, teachers, farm labourers, and public service workers. Police often appear on the other side of those disputes, protecting property, clearing picket lines, controlling marches, or making arrests. Police labour history places the officers inside the workforce. It asks what happens when the people normally sent to control a strike become strikers themselves. Memphis provided an answer that was difficult for every side. The officers discovered that police culture could strengthen union solidarity. Loyalty to fellow officers made it harder for individuals to cross the picket line. The same commitment that helped officers depend on one another during dangerous calls could be redirected against supervisors, union leaders, and city officials. The city discovered that threatening to fire everyone was easier than replacing everyone. Police work required screening, training, equipment, supervision, and local knowledge. Announcing a rapid hiring program created the appearance of firmness, but rebuilding the patrol force would have taken far longer than the emergency could continue. Union leaders discovered that they could lose control of their own members. The Police Association president urged officers to return, but the rank and file refused. This revealed a weakness in treating union leadership as the only voice that mattered. The men outside the stations had their own understanding of what the strike required, and they were willing to reject anyone who appeared ready to compromise too soon. Residents discovered that the legal status of a strike did not determine whether it would happen. Tennessee law prohibited public employee strikes. Courts issued return-to-work orders. The mayor declared absent officers resigned. None of those actions brought the officers back immediately. A law can make an action illegal. It cannot guarantee compliance when hundreds of employees believe acting together gives them enough protection to resist. The government still had to choose whether to arrest, dismiss, negotiate with, or replace them. Memphis used all four threats or methods in some form. It arrested strikers, announced resignations, opened recruitment efforts, and continued negotiations. In the end, negotiation restored the departments. This did not prove the strike was justified. It showed that emergency government alone could contain the consequences but could not resolve the underlying labour problem. The story also faded because later events changed what Americans associated with policing. Crime, drug enforcement, police militarization, Racial profiling, community policing, mass incarceration, police shootings, body cameras and public protests became more prominent subjects in the following decades. The labour position of officers remained important, but it was usually discussed through pensions, political endorsements, disciplinary procedures, or contract protections rather than the possibility of an entire patrol force walking out. Police strikes were rare enough to feel like exceptions rather than a continuing national pattern. The Memphis walkout did not become the beginning of regular police strikes across the country. Its immediate aftermath instead strengthened rules and procedures designed to prevent another one. That success helped erase the reason for the reforms. When a new process prevents a crisis from recurring, later residents may remember the process and forget the event that created it. Arbitration language in a city charter does not automatically tell people about soldiers at intersections, darkened streets, or officers being arrested outside their own headquarters. The legal text remained. The lived memory weakened. The strike was also overshadowed locally by the many other events attached to Memphis. The city's public identity includes the civil rights movement, the sanitation strike, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, blues and soul music, Beale Street, Stax Records, Sun Studio, Elvis Presley, Graceland, River Commerce, racial division, suburban growth, and repeated battles over poverty and public services. The 1978 strike had to compete with all of those histories. It did not fit easily into tourism. There is no obvious walking tour for a week in which residents mostly stayed home. The important locations were police stations, firehouses, city hall offices, courtrooms, checkpoints, and ordinary streets. Much of the event consisted of absence. Officers not in cars, firefighters not at stations, customers not in restaurants, visitors not arriving, and residents not outside after curfew. Absence leaves fewer monuments. The strike matters precisely because it involved ordinary systems people notice only when they stop working. Police protection usually appears as a background service. A patrol car passes, a dispatcher answers, an officer arrives. Most residents do not think about the contract, pension system, shift schedule, union vote, or political negotiations supporting that response. For 8 days, Memphis had to see those hidden arrangements. The city learned that public order did not come only from laws. It came from people agreeing to perform assigned roles. Officers had to report. Supervisors had to direct them. City officials had to pay them. Unions had to represent them. Courts had to define the limits of emergency power. Residents had to accept restrictions or continue ordinary activity at greater risk. When several of those relationships failed at once, Memphis did not lose all order. It lost the normal method of producing it. The replacement was expensive, restrictive, and temporary. That may be the most useful way to remember the 8 days. The strike was not evidence that a city needs no police because Memphis avoided complete collapse. It was not evidence that police demands should always be accepted because their work is essential. It was evidence that essential services require a bargaining system strong enough to handle conflict before the public becomes the pressure point. The city's response after 1978 tried to formalise that lesson. The Charter Amendment prohibited strikes while requiring arbitration procedures after 7 days of economic deadlock. The language treated labour peace as a shared responsibility. Employees were required to continue working, and the government was required to provide a route out of an impasse. That balance was imperfect. Any arbitration system raises questions about who controls public spending, how comparable salaries are measured, and whether unions or officials have incentives to bargain seriously before the deadline. Still, it was more deliberate than the system Memphis had used in August 1978. That earlier system depended on threats until the threats became real. Officers threatened to strike. The city threatened dismissal. Union allies threatened wider action. The mayor threatened to remove union recognition. Courts threatened penalties. Residents were threatened by the loss of protection, even though they had made none of the bargaining decisions. The amendment attempted to move future conflicts into a procedure before they reached that stage. The weak America almost forgot was therefore not without a legacy. Its legacy appeared in rules, bargaining relationships, and a greater understanding of how quickly a dispute involving public safety employees could affect an entire city. Historical analysis later found that the strikes changed the relationship between Memphis and all of its municipal unions, and contributed to greater long-term stability. The episode also left questions that remain unsettled. How should a city measure the value of police work? How much authority should a police union possess over public policy? Can an officer hold both an oath to the public and the right to collective resistance when the city violates its obligations? Who bears the cost when the bargaining process fails? The 8-day strike did not answer those questions for every city. It showed what happens when no answer has been accepted in advance. Memphis spent the middle of August 1978 relying on soldiers, deputies, supervisors, curfews, emergency courts, and residents who made themselves less visible. It survived because thousands of people reduced their lives around the weakened system. Then the officers returned, and the reduction ended. Traffic continued after 10. Restaurants remained open. Patrol cars followed familiar routes. Fire crews answered alarms. The guard departed. The headlines moved elsewhere. A person driving through Memphis a few weeks later could have crossed the same intersections without seeing any evidence that soldiers had recently stood there. A customer could have eaten dinner after dark without remembering that restaurants had been emptied by order of the mayor. A resident could have called the police and heard a normal dispatcher, without thinking about the week when every available unit had to be reserved for the most urgent calls. That is how events disappear from public memory. The place recovers. The systems resume. The people who lived through the disruption return to work, raise families, retire, and move away. The emergency becomes a story told only when someone asks why a certain rule was adopted, or why an older resident still remembers guard vehicles beneath the traffic lights. Memphis did not lose its police completely during those 8 days. It lost most of the patrol force on which ordinary protection depended. It replaced that force with a restricted version of city life and enough emergency manpower to hold the streets until bargaining resumed. The difference matters. It prevents the story from becoming an exaggerated tale of a lawless city. It also prevents the opposite mistake of treating the weak as a minor inconvenience. For the residents of Memphis, the strike changed when they could leave home, how businesses operated, who patrolled neighborhoods, and whether help would arrive normally. It exposed the city's dependence on workers whose uniforms made many people forget they were workers at all. By the time the badges returned, Memphis had paid for that lesson in lost business, military deployment, public fear, legal conflict, damaged trust, and 8 nights when everyone watched the streets more carefully than before. The contracts ended the walkout. The Charter Amendment changed the process. The city moved on. What remained was a record of the brief period when Memphis discovered that the line between public order and public uncertainty was maintained not only by laws and uniforms, but by agreements between people who had stopped believing one another.